The arbiter's voice filled the gallery of standing before the last of the crowd had settled, and the word it carried was death. Correction is affirmed. The standing error known provisionally as the Talrith juvenile is to be dissolved by lawful means within one cycle of this ruling. Nobody in the tiered dark of that vast round chamber gasped, because to the 800 delegates of the concord of standing law, nothing had happened. A clerical matter had been resolved. A record had been tidied. On the floor of the well, under a cone of pale ceiling light that fell like water into a drain, a small figure sat on a bench built for something 4 times her size, and did not understand the sentence, because no one had bothered to give her the words in a tongue she owned. Captain Sabine Orlov understood every word of it, and she was on her feet before she had decided to stand. "No," she said. The sound of a human voice raised in the gallery of standing was such a rare and graceless thing that heads turned across the tiers, long heads, plated heads, the slow swiveling stalks of the ombre jurists in their high box. A marshal near the rail lifted a hand to remind her that the well was not hers to speak into. Sabine ignored the hand. She had spent 19 years pulling wounded people off floors that were trying to kill them, and she recognized this room now for exactly what it was. "That child is not an error," she said, and her voice did the thing it did when she was past fear and into the cold place behind it, went flat and clear and carried to the ceiling. "She is a living person. She is a member of the crew of a Terran vessel, and you do not get to vote her dead." Down in the well, the small figure turned her head toward the sound of the captain she knew, and the light caught her face, ashen skin gone the soft gray lavender of a winter dusk, a spill of silver hair, eyes too large for the little bones around them, dark and wet bright and fixed on Sabine with a trust that had no business surviving this room. The child's name was Nyssa. She was 70, of the colony called Talrith, which the record now insisted had never lived, and therefore could not have died, and therefore had no survivors, and therefore the breathing evidence to the contrary sitting in the well was not a survivor but a mistake to be unmade. The arbiter's stalks bent toward Sabine with the terrible patience of something very old. "The Terran signatory is provisional," Arbiter Lomoftalu said, in the flat consensus voice the ombre used for rulings. "Provisional members observe. They do not object. Sit, Captain, or be removed and forfeit your standing to attend." "Then remove me," Sabine said, "but you will do it while I am still saying no." They removed her. 2 marshals with the smooth gray carapace of the Concord's peace service took her by the arms, not roughly, because there was no anger in the room, only procedure, and walked her up the aisle while she kept her eyes on the child. Nyssa had risen off the bench. She did not cry out. The 70 did not cry out. Grief in them went the other way, went inward and silent, so that the little one simply stood in the cone of light with her hands opening and closing on nothing, watching the only adult who had ever kept a promise to her being carried out of the room where they meant to kill her. The last thing Sabine saw before the great doors sealed was the Carend. They sat in the highest tier, a cluster of tall, elegant shapes robed in oyster gray, unhurried, and one of them, Executor Velsarin, who had filed the correction, who had signed the writ that made a living world into a legal absence, inclined his long pale head toward the captain as she was carried past below him, the way a man nods to acknowledge a game well played by an opponent who has, nonetheless, lost. Then the doors shut, and the corridor swallowed the sound of 800 delegates going back to their business. 61 days earlier, the survey cutter Ardent had come out of a long jump into the Talrith system, expecting to find a colony, and had found a grave that no one had reported. Sabine had read the file on the way in, because reading the file was the job. Talrith was a 70 agricultural holding, chartered under the Concord 90 local years back, a modest place, 3 surface settlements, a tidal power grid, 40,000 souls raising protein grain on a world with a sky the color of weak tea. The Ardent's tasking was routine, a wellness pass, a charter audit, the kind of unglamorous errand that fell to a provisional signatory's little survey ships because the great powers could not be bothered. Earth did the chores of the conquered and was grateful for the chance, because doing the chores was how a young species earned, one dull decade at a time, the right to a real seat. They came in over the day side and found the settlements gone. Not bombed. That was the thing that stayed with the whole crew afterward, the wrongness of it. Bombing left something, craters, scorch, the honest ugliness of violence. Talrith's settlements had been unmade. The tidal grid was pulled. The buildings were down to their foundations, and even the foundations had been cropped, sheared off level with the soil as if a blade the size of a continent had passed over the surface at grazing height. The grain fields were bare dirt, combed into long parallel furrows by machines that had scraped the topsoil down to bedrock and carried it away. Where 40,000 people had lived, there was a plain of raw stone and a smell, on the wind their sensors tasted, of nothing at all. Sterile, cleaned. Somebody reclaimed it, said Petrov, her exec, and the word tasted bad in his mouth even as he said it. Reclamation was a legal term. It described what happened to a chartered world when its charter lapsed, when a colony failed, went silent, defaulted on its conquered dues, and reverted to the common stock to be sold on to whoever wanted it. Reclamation was supposed to happen to empty worlds. There's no lapse notice in the file, Sabine said. She was looking at the furrows. You don't reclaim a living colony. File says the last dues payment was 90 days ago, on time, full. Then somebody's file is wrong, or somebody's world is. They found Nissa on the third day, because the young man at the censor board would not stop looking. His name was Tomas Reyes, and he was the youngest hand on the Ardent, 23, a survey tech who had come out to the deep black to see wonders and had spent his first tour cataloging mineral rights and charter numbers. He was the one who caught the flicker, a thermal ghost, small, intermittent, moving between the sheared foundations of the northernmost settlement in a pattern that was not wind and was not machinery. He flagged it 4 times before Petrov let him fly a drone down, and the drone found a hole. The reclamation machines had cropped the surface, but they had not gone deep. Under the northern settlement ran a stormwater cistern, a 70 thing, an old cut-stone tank the size of a chapel, and its access shaft had survived because it was capped with a slab of local basalt too heavy and too worthless to bother lifting. Something small had learned to move the drain grate at the bottom of the shaft. Something small had been living down there in the dark, on rainseep and the last of a settlement's spilled stores, for the better part of 3 months, alone, while the machines finished overhead and left, and while the silence came down and stayed. Sabine went down herself. She would not send Tomas, and she would not send Petrov, because whatever was down there had survived by being afraid of anything that came from above, and she was not going to have a frightened crewman and a frightened survivor meeting for the first time in the dark. She went down the shaft on a line with a hand lamp on its lowest setting and her helmet off, so that whatever waited would see a face and not a machine, and she sat down on the cold cistern floor a careful distance from the huddle of rags in the far corner, and she did what she knew how to do, which was wait and be still, and let the frightened thing decide. It took an hour. When the child finally came out of the corner, she came on all fours, low, keeping to the wall, and she stopped an arm's length away and studied the human's face for a long time with those enormous dark eyes, and then she reached out one thin hand and touched Sabine's cheek. Once, testing, the way you touch a stove to learn whether it will burn you. Sabine held still and let her. The little fingers were cold and they were shaking, not with cold but with the effort of hope, and Sabine understood, in the way you understand things in your chest before your head has the words, that whatever it cost her, she was not going to leave this child in this hole. "You're all right," Sabine said, though the child could not understand her. "You're all right now, I've got you. The 70 do not weep." But the little one leaned her whole weight forward until her forehead rested against the human's collarbone, and she stayed there, breathing, for a long time, and Sabine wrapped one arm around her back. She could have spanned with her hand, and felt the sharp architecture of ribs under thin skin, and did the arithmetic of 3 months alone in the dark, and put her chin down on the silver hair, and made silently a promise she did not yet know the price of. They logged her that same day. It was Petrov who insisted, and later Sabine would think that Petrov's stubborn, small-minded devotion to correct procedure had done more to save the child than any grand gesture in any courtroom. "She can't just be aboard," Petrov said that first night, standing in the door of the med bay where the ship's medic, an unhurried woman named Adiz Cow, was coaxing electrolyte gel into a body that had forgotten how to want food. "Cargo's logged. Passengers are logged. Everything on this ship that has a mass has a line in the manifest. She has a mass. She gets a line." "She's not cargo," Tomas said, from the corner where he had appointed himself without discussion, the child's personal furniture. "No," Petrov agreed, "so we don't log her as cargo, Captain." "What is she?" Sabine looked at the small shape on the bunk, wrapped now in a thermal blanket the medic had cut down to size, silver head just visible, watching all of them with the flat wariness of something that had learned adults were whether, sometimes survivable, never trusted. "Ward," Sabine said. "Log her as a ward of the vessel, under my hand." Petrov keyed it in. It was a nothing entry, a piece of housekeeping, the sort of line a survey captain wrote a dozen times a tour when a scientist's assistant hitched a ride or a rescued spacer needed a berth. "Ward of the vessel Ardent, under the hand of the master, Orlov S." He filled in the species field 70 and left the name field blank because she had not given them one, and he entered the date, and the manifest accepted the line and closed. And none of them, not the captain, not the exec, not the young man in the corner, understood that they had just done the single most important thing that would be done for this child by anyone, anywhere, in the whole affair that was coming. The name came 4 days out from Talrath. Adiz had been teaching her words, patient, unhurried, the way you gentle a half-wild animal, and the child had begun to give words back, 70 words at first, soft liquid things, and then, one at a time, a few human ones, hoarded and produced like coins. On the 4th night she was sitting in Tomas's lap in the mess while he showed her, for the 100th time, how the little light on his data slate could be made to jump from his hand to hers, and she watched it jump, and she laughed the first sound of pleasure any of them had heard out of her, a strange fluting thing that made 3 grown spacers go still with the force of it, and Tomas said, "There she is," and touched his own chest and said his name, Tomas, the way he had 30 times. And then touched her chest with one finger, and raised his eyebrows in the question he had asked 30 times. And this time she answered. "Nissa," she said. Then more firmly, as if the saying of it rebuilt something the dark had eaten, "Nissa." "Nissa," Tomas said, and grinned like a man who had struck water in a desert. "Captain, she's got a name." Sabine had Petrov enter it in the manifest before she slept that night. Name, Nissa. It went into the same line under the same hand, and it made the housekeeping entry into something with a shape a court would later have to look at and call by its true name, which was kinship. They were 9 days out from the nearest Concord relay when the summons found them. It came as a priority packet, flagged with the seal of the standing registry, and Petrov brought it to the captain's cabin himself rather than root it, because he had read the header and gone pale. Sabine read it twice. Then she read it a 3rd time slowly, because the words were arranged so that a reasonable person's eyes slid off them, and she made herself catch every one. The vessel Ardent was directed to convey to the gallery of standing, without delay, a standing error, recovered from the reclaimed holding formerly designated Talrath. The error was described as an unresolved biological remnant of a dissolved charter population. The Ardent's master was reminded that the concealment or protection of a standing error was itself a correctable offense. The packet was signed, on behalf of the petitioning party, by Executor Vel Sorin of the Karen Ascendancy, and countersigned by the Standing Registry as a matter of course, the way a clerk stamps a form. Sabine sat with it for a long time. "They want her back," Petrov said. It was not quite a question. "They want to finish," Sabine said. "The machines missed one, they want to finish." "Standing error," Petrov read over her shoulder, and his voice had gone thin. "Biological remnant. They can't, she's a child, Sabine, she's a person. You can't just—" "They already did," Sabine said. She was looking at the phrase dissolved charter population, and something cold and clear was assembling itself in her mind, the way a diagnosis assembles out of scattered symptoms. "That's what the furrows were. That's why there's no crater. They didn't attack a colony. Under the law there was no colony. They filed a paper that said Talrith was empty, lapsed, defaulted, dead, and then they went and made the paper true. 40,000 people, and on the record not one of them was ever alive on the day the machines came, because the record says they were already gone." She set the slate down very gently, as if it might go off. "And she's the one piece of the world that doesn't match the paper. As long as she's breathing, the paper's a lie." "So we don't bring her in," Tomas said from the doorway. None of them had heard him come. His young face was set in a way none of them had seen on it before. "We turn around. We take her somewhere they can't." "There's nowhere they can't," Petrov said, not unkindly. "It's the conquered, son, it's every charted world. You run, you're a fugitive vessel hiding a fugitive from the whole of standing law. And the day they catch you, she's got no case at all, and neither do we." "So what?" Tomas said. "We hand her over, we bring her to them and let them." "We bring her in," Sabine said, "and we make them do it in the light." The cabin went quiet. "They wrote this to be done in the dark," she said, tapping the slate. "A packet, a clerk's stamp, a machine on an empty world. Nobody watching. That's how you unmake 40,000 people and call it tidying up. So we don't run and we don't hide her and we don't give them the dark. We take her to the biggest, brightest room in the Concord, and we stand her up in it, and we make 800 delegates look at her face while somebody says out loud that she is an error to be dissolved. And then we make them do it in front of everyone if they're going to do it at all." She looked up at Tomas, and her voice was very steady. "Law killed her people, Tomas, on paper with a signature. I don't have a fleet. I've got a manifest line and a room full of witnesses. So we're going to fight the paper with paper, in front of the whole galaxy, and we are not going to be quiet about it." It was, she would think much later, a good plan. It was a decent, brave, human plan, built on the assumption that if you forced powerful people to be cruel in public they would flinch. She had not yet understood how much of the galaxy had already agreed, in writing, not to look. The seat of the Concord of standing law was not a planet but a ring, a slow gray wheel called Threshold, hung in the empty space between four claimed systems precisely, because it belonged to none of them, turning against the stars with the patience of something that intended to outlast every species that had ever bowed to it. The Ardent came and passed customs cutters and delegation yachts and the vast dark hulls of the great powers' embassy ships, and felt, docking, like a rowboat tying up among warships. The woman waiting for them at the airlock was small, sharp-featured, dressed in the plain charcoal that the provisional signatories people wore instead of the robes the old powers favored, and she was already talking before the seal had finished cycling. "Sabine Orlov, Inez Delgado Terran legation such as it is. I've read your manifest, I've read the Karen's petition, and I've had 6 hours to find us a defense, which is about 5 hours and 50 minutes more than the situation deserves, so let me save us both some grief." She looked past the captain into the ship, and when she saw the small silver head peering around Tomas's leg, something in her hard face moved and then went carefully still. "That's her. That's Nissa. Don't use her name in the well, I mean it. The moment you make her a person to that room, you make her a person the Karen have to kill on the record, and they'd rather she stay a thing they can dissolve quietly. A named 70 child is a scandal. Keep the scandal in your pocket until we need it." Inez was moving already, waving them down the docking arm. "Walk with me. You've got a hearing in 9 hours, and there is a great deal you don't know, and most of it is bad." She told them, walking. She told them fast, in the clipped shorthand of a woman who had learned her whole trade in rooms where the clock was an enemy. The Karen ascendancy was one of the Concord's founding powers, old, rich, and patient in the way that only the very old and very rich learn to be. They did not conquer worlds, they acquired them. Their whole civilization was built on an instrument called the writ of quietus, a thing so procedural, so buried in the fine machinery of Concord charter law, that most delegates had never read it and none of them had ever fought it. A writ of quietus declared a chartered population legally lapsed, dissolved for cause. Once the writ stood, the world was empty in the eyes of the law, whatever might be walking around on it, and an empty chartered world reverted to the common stock, and the common stock could be purchased, and the Karen always had the purchase price ready before the ink was dry. "They've done it 40 times that anyone's counted," Inez said. "Small colonies, frontier holdings, places too poor to have friends and too far out to have witnesses. They find a technicality, a late filing, a disputed census, a lapsed environmental bond, and they file the writ, and by the time anyone who cares hears about it, the world's been reclaimed and sold, and there's nothing left to argue over but bookkeeping. It's not murder. That's the beautiful part from their side. You can't murder a population that the record says was already dead. You just tidy up an empty world." "Talrith wasn't empty," Sabine said. "Its dues were current," Petrov checked. "Its dues were current," Inez agreed grimly, "which is exactly the crack I've been trying to get a fingernail into for 6 hours. The Karen's writ says Talrith lapsed for a census default, that the colony failed to file a verified population count 3 cycles running, which under charter is grounds for presumed dissolution. It's a lie. The counts were filed. But the counts were filed with the standing registry, and the standing registry's audit of those filings is sealed, and the registrar who sealed them," she stopped, and gave Sabine a look that had a whole education in it, "retired last month to a very comfortable estate in Karen space. So yes, it's a lie. And no, at this moment I cannot prove it, because the proof is behind a seal I have no standing to break." They had come to a viewport, and Inez stopped, and for a moment the hardness went out of her and left something older and more tired. "Here's what you have to understand, Captain, before you walk into that room, because if you don't understand it you'll do something brave and stupid and lose her in the first hour. That court is not evil. I need you to hear that. It would be easier if it were evil. It is worse than evil. It is correct. Every soul in that room believes they are doing law, and law is the only thing standing between 800 species and a galaxy on fire, and they are not entirely wrong about that. The writ stands. It was filed correctly. It was countersigned correctly. Under the law as written, Talrith was empty when the machines came, and a thing recovered from an empty world is a remnant, and a remnant of a dissolved population is a standing error, and standing errors get corrected. There is not one step in that chain the court will see as cruelty. They'll see a captain who's grown attached to a stray, and a tidy piece of housekeeping she's trying to obstruct, and they will be gentle with you and firm with the law, and at the end of it that child will be just as dead as if they'd hated her. She let that sit. So we are not going to win by being right. We are going to win, if we win at all, by making the law choke on its own throat, and I do not yet know how. But I know it starts with keeping her alive through the first hearing, and the first hearing starts by you not saying her name." Nissa, who had been carried the whole way in Tomas's arms, chose that moment to reach out toward the viewport, toward the turning stars, with one small hand, and make a soft sound of wonder. And every human in the corridor felt the same thing at the same time, the exact thing Inez had just warned them against, the swelling, dangerous certainty that this was a person, and that no room full of robes was going to unmake her. Inez watched their faces do it. She sighed. "God help us," she said. "You've already lost the scandal out of your pocket, haven't you, all of you?" Yes, Sabine said. Yes, said Tomas. Inez looked at the child a moment longer. Then very quietly, so quietly that Sabine wondered afterward if she'd meant to be heard. Yeah, me too. She turned on her heel. 9 hours, come on. There's a filing I need to teach you not to sign. The first hearing was not held in the great round gallery of standing. It was held in a side chamber, one of 100 identical rooms where the Concord's real work was done. A gray box with a raised bench for the presiding officer, and a rail for the parties, and a single high window through which thresholds captured sunlight fell in a hard, clean bar across the floor. The presiding officer was not the arbiter. It was a lesser jurist, an ombre deputy named SciFiNarration, whose slow-stalked head took in the human party at the rail with the mild attention of a functionary working through a docket. Across the well stood the Karen, not the executor himself, not yet, but 2 of his advocates, tall oyster-robed shapes who did not so much as glance at the humans, as if to look at the opposing party would be to concede that there was one. Nissa stayed on the Ardent. Inez had been immovable about that. They have not yet demanded her physical presence, and until they do, she does not set foot in this ring. Every hour she's a document and not a body is an hour they can't finish this. So it was the humans alone at the rail, Sabine and Inez and Petrov, when the deputy opened the matter. Petition of correction, SciFiNarration read in the consensus flat ombre voice, filed by the Karen Ascendancy, concerning a standing error recovered from the reclaimed holding formerly designated Talrith. The petitioner asks affirmation that the recovered remnant falls under the dissolved charter and is subject to lawful correction. The vessel of recovery has filed an objection. The stalked head tilted. The vessel of recovery may state the ground of its objection. Inez stepped to the rail. The vessel objects, she said, on the ground that the recovered person is not a remnant of a dissolved population, but a living individual under the protection of the recovering vessel's flag, entered on that vessel's manifest as a ward under the hand of its master, and thereby a member of a Terran household under Terran kinship law, which the Concord Charter holds inviolate. One of the Karen advocates spoke for the first time and did not bother to step to the rail to do it. The Concord Charter holds the kinship of signatories inviolate, it said, in a voice like water moving under ice. The Terran signatory is provisional. Provisional kinship is not vested. The point fails. The point does not fail, Inez said, because the Charter's kinship article makes no distinction between provisional and full signatories in its plane. The point fails, said SciFiNarration without heat, and Sabine felt the floor drop out of the morning. Provisional signatories exercise provisional rights. Kinship vesting is a full right. Deputy finds the objection insufficient as to kinship. The stalked head swiveled a degree. Is there a further ground? Inez did not miss a beat, and only Sabine, standing close, saw the white at her knuckles. Yes. The vessel objects on the ground that the recovered person cannot be a remnant of a dissolved population because the recovered person is living, and a living person is not the remnant of anything. The writ of quietus declares Talrith's population dissolved. A declaration is not a fact. This child breathes. The court is asked to affirm that a breathing individual is the dead remainder of a population. The same court's paperwork says never existed on the day she was found alive within it. That is not a correction of an error. That is the creation of one. For the first time, the deputy paused. It was not much of a pause. To anyone else in the room, it might have looked like a functionary consulting a note. But Inez had told them what to watch for, the small hitch. The half-second in which even an ombre jurist's consensus mind had to root a question it had not been given the answer to, and Sabine saw it, and her heart moved. The objection raises a question of first standing, SciFiNarration said at last. The deputy is not competent to resolve a question of first standing. The matter is referred upward to the full gallery and the arbiter, to be heard within the ordinary time. The stalked head bent. The recovered person is to be produced before the gallery at that hearing. This is now required. Marshals will attend the vessel to confirm the person's presence and secure it against flight. Against flight, Inez repeated very evenly. The petitioner has represented that the recovering vessel has expressed an intent to obstruct correction. The court secures against flight as a matter of course. The deputy was already closing the docket. The vessel will surrender custody of the recovered person to the court's marshals for holding pending the gallery hearing. No, Sabine said. It was the second time in her life she had said that word in one of these rooms, and it came out of her exactly as flat and clear as the first. Selivren looked at her with the mild bafflement of a creature encountering a phenomenon outside its docket. The master of the vessel does not have standing to refuse the court's custody order. Then I'm refusing it without standing, Sabine said. She's a child. She's been alone in the dark for 3 months. She has learned in 9 days that some adults keep her safe, and you are proposing to take her out of the one place she has ever felt safe and put her in a holding cell run by strangers who have been ordered to secure her like cargo. I will bring her to your hearing. I'll bring her to every hearing you like. But she stays on my ship, under my hand, in her own berth, with people she knows, until the day you make me stand her up in that room. That's not a legal position. I know it's not a legal position. It's the only one I've got. There was a silence in the gray box. Inez did not try to fix it. That was the thing Sabine remembered. Inez Delgado, who had corrected her a dozen times in 9 hours, who had drilled her on what not to say, stood at the rail and said nothing at all, and let the captain's impossible, unlawful, entirely human refusal hang in the clean bar of light. Selivren's stalks moved in a slow, complicated gesture that the humans could not read. When the deputy spoke again, the flat voice had not changed, but the ruling had. The court notes the master's representation as to the welfare of the recovered person, Selivren said. The court is not indifferent to welfare. Custody will remain with the vessel under martial watch on the master's personal recognizance, pending the gallery. The master is advised that the value of this indulgence is precisely 0 if the gallery affirms correction, and that she has purchased her ward not 1 hour of life, but only a better place to spend the hours the ward already has. The docket closed. These proceedings are adjourned. Out in the corridor, Petrov let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for an hour. That went badly, Inez said. We lost kinship. We lost custody as a clean matter and only kept her aboard on the deputy's charity, which the deputy went out of its way to tell us is worthless. And we've now guaranteed that the next time this is heard, it's heard in the big room in front of the carend with the child in the well. She was already walking. But Sabine said. But the deputy referred the living person question upward as a matter of first standing. First standing means the founding articles, the oldest law the conquered has, the stuff the whole structure is built on, the promises the founders made to each other before there was a conquered to keep them. The deputy couldn't answer it. That means it's never been answered. That means somewhere in the founding articles there is a question about whether the law can call a living person dead, and nobody has ever forced the conquered to look at it. She stopped and turned, and for the first time since the airlock there was something in her hard face that was not despair. They've been doing this for 400 years, Captain, 40 worlds. And in 400 years nobody ever kept one of the survivors alive long enough, or loud enough, to make the court answer the one question the whole rotten instrument depends on not being asked. Which is whether a signature can kill. Inez started walking again, faster now. I need the founding articles, all of them, the originals, not the digest, and I need to know everything there is to know about a world called Taurith, and I need it before the carend realize what question just got asked. Because Vel Soren has done this 40 times, and he is not going to enjoy being the first man to hear a court ask out loud whether his whole life's work is murder. The marshals came aboard the Ardent that evening and took up station in the passageway outside Nissa's berth, Two gray carapaced peace officers who stood with the unmoving patience of furniture and watched the door around the clock. They did not interfere. They did not speak except once, when Tomas brought them each a bulb of the ship's coffee out of some stubborn refusal to treat them as enemies, and the nearer one considered the offering for a long moment before it said, in careful trade standard, "We are not permitted," and looked, Tomas thought, almost sorry about it. The child did not like them. It was the closest thing to a problem the Ardent's crew had in those days of waiting that Nyssa, who had begun to unbend, who had begun to eat and to sleep through the ship's night, and to follow Tomas around the survey deck like a small silver shadow, would go rigid and silent the moment she was carried past the two shapes in the passage. She had a sense for them the humans lacked. Adiz, the medic, watched it happen and understood it before the rest of them did. "She can smell what they're for," Adiz said. They were in the med bay, and Nyssa was asleep in the cut-down bunk with two of Tomas's fingers gripped in one small fist, the way she slept now, unwilling to go under without a human anchor. The Sevani have a sense we don't have a word for. It reads intent, near as I can tell, fear, aggression, the chemistry of a body that means you harm. It's how a small forest creature survives among big ones. She knew about those two before they said a word. She knows they're here to take her. "They're not going to take her," Tomas said. Adiz looked at him. This young man who had appointed himself the child's furniture and her guardian, and somewhere in 9 days, without any of them deciding it, her family. And she did not tell him what she thought their odds were. "No," she said instead, "they're not." Nyssa's alienness was a thing the crew learned in pieces, and every piece made her more precious to them, and the coming loss of her more unbearable. She did not see color the way they did. The survey deck's status lights, red and amber and green, were all one shade to her, and she navigated instead by texture and by the faint electrical fields of live equipment, trailing her fingertips along conduit runs the way a blind woman reads a wall. She hoarded. It was a Sevani thing, Adiz thought, bred into a people who had lived close to famine. The child collected small objects, a bolt, a ration wrapper, a spare fuse, and cached them in the corners of her berth in careful arrangements, and grew agitated if they were moved. She could go still in a way no human child could go still, so completely that her breathing stopped being visible, a predator evasion reflex that broke Adiz's heart every time she saw it. Because you did not learn to disappear that thoroughly unless disappearing had once been the only thing between you and the machines. And she sang. Not for them, she did not perform, but when she thought she was alone, when she was arranging her small cache or watching the stars through the viewport, a thread of sound would come out of her, high and liquid and utterly unlike any human music, in intervals that did not resolve to any scale the humans owned. Tomas recorded it once quietly and played it for Adiz, and the medic listened to the whole thing with her hand over her mouth and at the end said only, "That's a lullaby. I'd bet my license. Somebody used to sing her that. Somebody who's under those furrows now." And Tomas took the recording and locked it away and could not listen to it again for a long time. This was the thing the Karen were calling a standing error. This was the biological remnant to be corrected. The crew of the Ardent lived with her for the days of waiting and learned her, and the learning was the cruelest possible preparation for what the law intended, and not one of them would have traded a minute of it. Inez Delgado did not sleep in those days. She took a berth aboard the Ardent because the legation's quarters on threshold were, she said, wired by 3 governments and cleaned by a 4th, and she worked at the mess table with a slate in each hand and a growing wall of despair behind her eyes that she let no one but Sabine see. The founding articles were worse than she had feared. "There are 9 of them," she told Sabine on the 3rd night. "The first standing. 9 articles the founders agreed on before there was a Concord, the whole thing's built on them. Every charter and writ and correction hangs off these 9 sentences. And they're beautiful, Sabine, that's the hell of it. They're the most beautiful law I've ever read. No standing shall be denied for weakness. The record shall answer to the world and not the world to the record. No power shall make by decree a thing that is not so. She laughed, and there was no humor in it. That last one, Article 3, no power shall make by decree a thing that is not so. Do you understand what that is? That's the answer. That's the whole answer. A writ of quietus that declares a living population dead is a decree that makes a thing that is not so. Article 3 should void it in a single sentence. So we win. So we should win, Inez said, except that Article 3 has never once been cited to void a writ of quietus in 400 years and 40 worlds, and I have spent 3 nights trying to understand why, and tonight I finally do, and I wish I didn't. She turned the slate around. Because the Karen got there first, 200 years ago. There's a ruling, Concord versus the holding of Vess, where a colony's survivors tried exactly this argument. Article 3, the decree can't make the dead live or the living dead, and the arbiter of the day agreed with them completely, and then found a way around it that's so elegant I could be sick. The arbiter ruled that the writ of quietus does not decree that the population is dead. It decrees that the population is dissolved, that its charter is void, its standing lapsed, its legal personhood surrendered. Whether the bodies are breathing is, the ruling says, a matter of biology immaterial to standing. The writ doesn't say you're dead, Sabine. It says you don't count. And Article 3 only forbids decreeing a false fact. It doesn't forbid decreeing that a true fact, a living child, doesn't matter. Sabine was quiet for a while. Then that's the fight, she said finally. Not whether she's alive, whether being alive counts. That's the fight, Inez agreed. And it's a fight nobody has won in 400 years, in front of a court whose entire existence depends on the answer being no, because if a living person's life counts for standing all on its own, then half the Concord's founding acquisitions were murders, and the whole map gets called into question, and no court in history has ever ruled a thing that unmakes the ground it stands on. She rubbed her eyes. I can make them ask the question. The deputy already did that for us. What I can't yet do is make them survive answering it the right way. Then we give them a reason, Sabine said. A legal reason. No, Sabine was looking down the passage, toward the berth where a small silver head slept with a young man's fingers in its fist. A human one. You keep telling me the law can't see her as a person, so we stop asking the law to. We make the room see her. 800 delegates in ease. You said it yourself, the Karen do this in the dark because it can't survive the light. So we put her in the light, not as a document, as a child. We break your own rule. We make them look at her face and then say the word correction out loud. And we make every delegate in that room decide, in public, on the record, whether they're the kind of person who votes a child dead. That's not law, Inez said. No, Sabine agreed. It's the thing law is supposed to be for. You do the law, I'll do the room. Inez looked at her for a long moment. You know what they'll do if you make it about her face. They'll keep her out of the gallery. They'll rule she's too distressing to be produced, and hear it all on paper and dissolve a document. Then we make them keep a child out of her own trial in front of the whole Concord, Sabine said, and we make sure everyone sees them do it. Every way they win, we make it cost them a piece of the thing they can't afford to lose, which is the fiction that this is clean. She stood. You said Soren's done this 40 times and never had a fight. 40 times in the dark. He doesn't know how to do it in the light and ease. Nobody's ever made him. That's our whole edge. We're not better lawyers than the Karen. We're just not ashamed. And they are, whether they know it or not, and shame is a lever if you're willing to be cruel enough to use it. The Karen made their first real move 2 days before the gallery hearing, and they made it, characteristically, without ever touching the case at all. It came to Inez as a quiet word from a colleague in the legation, and she brought it to Sabine's cabin with her face the color of ash. The Terran provisional signatory was due for its septennial review, the periodic vote by which the full members decided whether a provisional species had earned advancement, or should have its provisional status extended, or, in rare and ruinous cases, revoked. Earth's review was 11 years out. It had just been moved. A motion had been entered, quietly, through the proper channels, to advance the Terran review to the current session, citing concerns regarding the Terran signatories' respect for standing law as demonstrated in a pending correction matter. "They're threatening Earth," Sabine said. "They're not threatening anything, that's what makes it art." Inez sat down heavily. "There's no threat on paper. There's a procedural motion entirely in order to review a provisional signatory's fitness, and it just happens to have been entered the week we started making noise about a writ of quietus. And the message, which is nowhere and everywhere, is this: keep fighting, and it won't be one child who pays. It'll be Earth." 50 years of doing the Concord's chores, every dull audit, every thankless wellness pass, the whole long patient climb toward a real seat, all of it on the table because a survey captain wouldn't hand over a stray. She looked up. "And the worst part, Sabine, they're right that it's a real risk. If the legation fights the correction and loses, and Earth's fitness is up for a vote in the same session, in the same building, in front of the same delegates we've just annoyed, we could actually lose the seat. Everything Earth's built here, for her." Sabine was quiet for a long time. "Have you told the legation?" she asked. "I had to, it's their review." Inez's jaw was tight. "The instruction came back an hour ago, unofficial, deniable, but clear." She made herself say it. "Stand down. Surrender the child to the court's custody. Let the correction proceed. Preserve the review." The word they used was proportionality. One life against a species' whole future in the Concord. They didn't even think it was a hard call. She looked at her hands. 40,000 Sevani are already under the furrows, and the Karen made that legal, and now they've arranged it so that the price of not letting them make it 40,001 is Earth's own seat at the table. That's the trap, Captain. That's why nobody's ever won this, because they never fight you on the child. They fight you on everything else you love, until handing over the child is the reasonable thing, the proportionate thing, the grown-up thing, and you do it yourself, and you even feel wise about it. She had expected Sabine to rage. Sabine did not rage. Sabine sat with it, the way she had sat with the summons, the way she had sat down in the dark of the cistern and waited an hour for a frightened child to decide the human was safe. "When I was a medic," Sabine said at last, "before I ever had a ship, we had a rule: triage. You sort the wounded by who you can save, and you spend your effort where it does the most good, and sometimes that means you walk past someone who's dying and you let them die, because saving them costs you 3 you could have saved instead. It's the right rule. I've lived by it. It kept more people alive than I can count." She looked up. "And there's a thing they don't tell you about triage and ease, that every medic learns and none of us say out loud. It only works if the person walking the line is somebody who would save everyone if they could. The second you get a person who's comfortable walking past the dying, who's good at it, who does the arithmetic and feels wise, you don't have triage anymore. You have a person deciding who's worth saving and dressing it up in a word that used to mean something. Proportionality." She said the word the way you'd hold up something rotten. One life against a species' future. They want me to do the arithmetic, and the arithmetic is right. And I'm not going to do it, because the day a human being can look at that child and do the arithmetic and walk past, we don't deserve the seat they're threatening to take. That's what the seat is for. That's the only thing it's for. "The legation's given an instruction," Inez said quietly. "The legation isn't her master, I am, it's on the manifest." Sabine stood. "Under my hand, they can revoke Earth's provisional status. They can't revoke that now. You said you can make them ask the question, make them ask it. I'll deal with the room and I'll deal with the legation. And if the price of that child's life is Earth's seat, then we'll find out what Earth is actually worth, won't we, when somebody finally asks." The legation sent a man to collect the child the morning of the gallery hearing. His name was Aldous Farr, and he was a career diplomat, silver at the temples, courteous in the way of men who have spent 30 years making unbearable things sound reasonable. And he came up the Ardent's boarding ramp with 2 aides and a datapad bearing an order. And he found Captain Sabine Orlov waiting for him at the top of it with her arms folded and Petrov at her shoulder, and the whole off-watch crew arranged behind her in the passageway in a manner that was not quite a wall and not quite not one. Captain Orlov. Farr had a good voice, warm and regretful. I think you know why I'm here. Let me say first that everyone in the legation admires what you've done, truly. You found a frightened child and you gave her comfort and safety, and that is a credit to you and to your crew and to the whole idea of who we're trying to be out here. Nobody is going to take that from you. He held up the datapad gently as if it were something fragile. But the situation has grown larger than one ship and larger than one child, and I've been sent to take the weight of it off your shoulders, where it never should have landed. The legation will assume custody. We'll surrender the child to the court under formal protest. We'll preserve every ounce of Earth standing, and you'll have done everything a decent person could do. Let me carry it from here. It was, Sabine thought, a genuinely kind speech. That was the terrible thing about the whole affair. How much of the machinery that meant to kill this child was operated by kind people saying reasonable things. No, she said. Farr's regret deepened professionally. Captain, I don't think you understand I understand it better than you do, Mr. Farr, because I've read her file and I've read the writ and I've held her while she slept, and you've done none of those things. Sabine did not raise her voice. You want to take the weight off my shoulders. I appreciate that. But you've got the weight wrong. The weight isn't the child. The weight is what we become if we hand her over. You want to preserve Earth standing. Here's what our standing is actually worth. The day we let a court vote a child dead because fighting it was inconvenient, nothing. It's worth exactly nothing. A seat at a table where that's the price of admission is not an honor. It's a confession. She unfolded her arms. She's a ward of this vessel, entered under my hand. Custody is mine to give, and I'm not giving it. If the legation wants to relieve me of my command to get at her, it's welcome to try, and it's welcome to explain to the review board why it seized a Terran captain's ship to hand a Sevani child to her executioners. That'll look wonderful in the record. The record answers to the world, Mr. Farr. Someone told me that recently. I think it's supposed to be one of the things we believe. Farr looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked past her, at the crew filling the passageway, at Adiz, at Petrov, at young Tomas Reyes standing near the back with the child in his arms, Nissa's silver head tucked under his chin, her enormous dark eyes fixed on the stranger with the datapad, and her small body gone utterly predator still. Something in the diplomat's practiced face flickered. The review is real, Captain, he said quietly, and for the first time he sounded like a man and not an office. I'm not inventing it to frighten you. If you fight this and it goes wrong, we could lose the seat. Everything. 50 years. I've given my life to that seat. Men I started with have died for it out here, doing the chores, believing it meant something. He looked at the child again. I came up this ramp certain I was right. I want you to know that. Certain. And now I'm going to go back down it, Farr said slowly, and tell the legation that the captain refused, and that in my judgment forcing the matter would do more damage to Earth standing than the correction ever could. He almost smiled. Which is true, incidentally. It's the first true thing I've said all morning. God help us both, Captain. Win it if it can be won. I'll hold the review off as long as I can. He turned to go and stopped, and looked back one last time at the small silver child in the young man's arms. What's her name? Nissa, Sabine said. Nissa, Farr repeated, as if learning it committed him to something, which it did. Bring her home, Captain. He went back down the ramp. The seat and the 50 years and the whole patient climb went with him, out onto the table, wagered now on a fight nobody had ever won. They produced Nissa before the gallery of standing at the 16th hour of the station cycle, and the great round chamber, which held 800 delegates and had heard the fates of worlds, went quiet in a way its oldest members could not remember it going quiet, because the parties had brought a child into the well. Inez had lost that fight, and then won it in the space of a single filing. The court had ruled, as she predicted, that the recovered person need not be produced in the flesh, that the matter could be resolved on the documents, and that producing a distressed juvenile organism served no purpose the record required. And Inez had responded with a motion of terrible simplicity, that a correction is the dissolution of a living thing, and that no tribunal in the Concord's history had ever dissolved a living thing without first laying eyes on what it proposed to dissolve, and that to do so now, to vote a child out of existence sight unseen, as a line on a document, would be an act the record could not survive being seen to permit. She had not argued that Nissa should be produced. She had argued that the gallery could not afford to be the body that refused to look. And the arbiter, Lomoftelu, whose whole long life was the law and whose whole authority was the belief that the law was better than the powers that used it, had ruled that the person would be produced. So they carried her in. Sabine carried her. That had been decided without discussion, that if the child was to be stood in that well, she would be stood there in the arms of the one adult whose promise she trusted, and not marched in by marshals like the evidence the Karen called her. Sabine walked down the long aisle under 800 pairs of eyes with the small warm weight against her chest, and she felt Nissa's heart going like a bird's, too fast, and she felt the little body doing its terrible stillness, and she put her mouth close to the silver hair and murmured, over and over, the few 70 words Adiz had taught her, the words that meant near me, near me, near me. And she set the child on the great bench in the cone of light and knelt beside her so that their eyes were level. And stayed there, one hand on the small back, and turned her own face up toward the tears and let them all see it, the human and the child together, in the light they had been so carefully kept out of. Across the well, for the first time, Executor Vel Soren rose. He was tall even for a Karen, unhurried, robed in the oyster gray of his house, and his voice when he spoke was a beautiful instrument, low and warm and entirely without cruelty, which was the worst thing about it. Arbiter delegates, I'm aware of how this appears. He inclined his long head toward the child in the light. A small living thing brought into this room to be looked at, so that the honorable Terran advocate may ask you to feel, where the law asks you only to think. I do not begrudge her the tactic. In her place I would use it too. But I would ask the gallery to hold, for one moment, to the discipline that is the only thing any of us has ever had against the tide, the discipline of standing over sentiment. He turned to face the tears. We are not asked today whether this is a child. Plainly it is a child. We are asked whether it is a person in standing, and standing is not a matter of the heart. It is a matter of the record. The holding of Talrith was dissolved by a writ of quietus, lawfully filed, lawfully countersigned, unchallenged within the time allowed. On the day this juvenile was recovered, there was, in law, no Talrith population, and therefore no member of it. She is not a person the law failed to protect. She is a remnant the law does not recognize. Her heartbeat is not in dispute. Her standing is. And standing, delegates, this is the whole of it. Standing comes from the record, and the record is closed. He let it settle. He was very good. Sabine, kneeling in the well with her hand on the child's back, understood exactly how 40 worlds had gone into the dark, because the man did not sound like a murderer. He sounded like the last reasonable person in a room full of people about to make an emotional mistake. Then Inez Delgado rose, and she did not go to the rail. She walked out into the center of the well, and she stood beside the kneeling captain and the silver child, close enough to touch them, so that the three of them together made a single picture under the light, and she looked up at the tears and she said, "He's right." A stir went through the gallery. "He's right about the law," Inez said. "I want to say that plainly, because I'm not going to insult this body by pretending the law is on my side when it isn't. Executor Soren has stated the law correctly. The writ was filed correctly. The countersignature is in order. Under the law as it has been read for 400 years, this child has no standing, and what you are being asked to affirm is a routine correction, and everything the executor has told you is true." She paused. "And I am going to ask you to look at her anyway, not instead of thinking, as part of thinking. Because there is one question the executor did not put to you, and it is the only question that matters, and it is a question of law, the oldest law you have." She turned slowly, taking in the whole vast round of them. "Your first standing, Article 3. No power shall make by decree a thing that is not so. 200 years ago, in the matter of the holding of Ves, a survivor stood where this child sits and cited that article, and the arbiter of the day agreed the decree could not make the living dead, and then ruled that a writ of quietus does not decree death, only dissolution of standing, and that whether the body breathes is a matter of biology, immaterial to standing. That ruling is why she has no standing today. That ruling is why 40 worlds have gone quietly into the common stock with their people still on them. I have read it 100 times. And I have come to tell this gallery that the ruling in Ves is the single greatest error in the history of conquered law, and that every soul it has killed is on the record of this court, and that you have the chance today in the light to say so." Her voice did not rise. It did not need to, because Article 3 does not say, "No power shall decree a false fact." It says, "No power shall make by decree a thing that is not so." And a living, breathing, singing child who does not count, a person the record has agreed to treat as a corpse while her heart is beating in front of you, is a thing that is not so. It is the exact thing Article 3 was written to forbid. Not the lie that she is dead. The greater lie, that whether she lives is immaterial. That is the decree that makes a thing that is not so. That is the decree in front of you. And you can affirm it and be the court that Ves was. Or you can look at her and think, and be the court your founders hoped you'd be when they wrote 9 sentences down before there was anything to make them keep. She stepped back and left the captain and the child alone in the center of the light, and the gallery of standing, 800 delegates who had voted the fates of worlds, sat in a silence that had teeth in it. Sabine, kneeling, felt Nissa's small hand find hers and grip it. The child did not know what had been said. But she knew, in her sense, in the animal knowledge that had kept her alive, that the room had changed, that something in the chemistry of 800 bodies had shifted. And she looked up at the tears with her enormous dark eyes, not in fear now, but in a kind of grave, ancient attention, as if she too were waiting to learn what these large creatures were. High in the ombre box, Arbiter Loam of Toulouse stalks bent slowly downward, and when the old jurist spoke, the flat consensus voice had in it, for the first time, something that was almost strain. "The gallery will adjourn," the arbiter said. "The question of first standing raised by the Terran advocate is not small. The bench will deliberate. The recovered person will remain in the custody of the vessel, under watch, pending ruling. We are adjourned." And it was only later in the corridor, with the child asleep again in Tomas's arms, and the whole exhausted party moving back toward the docks, that Inez said the thing that took the victory out of the afternoon. "He didn't fight me," she said. "What?" "Soren, I just told 800 delegates that the foundation of his life's work is the greatest error in conquered history, and he sat there and let me, and he didn't fight me." Inez had stopped walking. "He's done this 40 times, Sabine. He's the best there is at it. And he let the first standing question go to deliberation without a word of rebuttal." She looked back toward the sealed doors of the gallery. "He wanted it deliberated. He's not afraid of the bench, which means he already knows how the bench comes out, which means," and the color went out of her face, "the fix isn't in the writ. The fix is in the bench. He's got the ruling before it's written. We didn't walk into a fair fight and start winning it. We walked exactly where he wanted us, out into the light where the loss will be public and total and settle the question his way for another 400 years. She started walking again, fast, grim. "I need the Ves record, the whole thing. And I need to know who's on that bench and what the Karen own, and I need it tonight. Because we've got until the bench rules to find the thing that scares Vel Soren. And I promise you it is not Article 3, because he walked into Article 3 smiling. The Vess record ran to 9,000 pages, and Inez read all of it in 2 nights, and what she found at the bottom of it was not comfort. The holding of Vess had been a mining colony, small and poor and far out, exactly the profile the Karen favored. Its people had fought the writ for 3 years, with better advocates and stronger allies than a single provisional captain and a stray. They had lost, and the reason they had lost, Inez came to understand, was not that their argument was weak. It was that they had made it a matter of interpretation, of what the founding articles meant, and interpretation was the one battlefield where the Karen could not be beaten, because interpretation was decided by the bench, and the bench, over centuries, had been patiently and legally made friendly to the powers that fed it. "It's not corruption," Inez said on the 3rd night, hollow-eyed over the mess table. "That's what I keep waiting to find and never do. Nobody's paying the jurists. It's cleaner than that and worse. The Karen endow things, chairs of jurisprudence, archives, the training houses where the young hombre jurists learn the law before they ever sit a bench. For 400 years, every jurist who's ever heard a writ of quietus learned their law in institutions the Karen paid to build, from texts the Karen paid to preserve, in a tradition the Karen have gently, patiently shaped to hold that standing comes from the record and the record is closed. They didn't buy the bench, they raised it. Every jurist on that panel believes, honestly in their bones, that Soren is right, not because anyone told them to, but because the whole edifice of everything they were taught to revere is built so that the alternative is unthinkable. That's the fix, Sabine. It's not a bribe you can expose. It's 400 years of school." "Then interpretation's a dead road," Sabine said. "Interpretation's a dead road. Article 3 goes to the bench, and the bench comes back Vess, and it settles the question for another 400 years, and Soren walks out having gotten exactly what he came for." Inez pushed the slate away. "So we don't fight on interpretation. We can't win what the meaning of the law is. We have to win on the facts. We have to make it not a question of what the writ means, but of whether the writ ever validly existed at all. Because a fixed bench can rule any way it likes on what the law means. It cannot, in open gallery, uphold a writ that everyone can see was procured by a lie, not without burning the one thing the whole edifice actually runs on, which is the belief that the record is true." She looked up. "The writ says Taurith lapsed for census default, failed to file its population counts 3 cycles running. That's the factual claim the whole thing hangs on. If that's a lie, if those counts were filed, then the writ had no lawful cause, and a writ with no lawful cause is void from the moment it was signed. Void ab initio. Never stood. And if it never stood, Taurith was never dissolved, and there's no dissolved population, and there's no remnant, and there's no correction, and there's no case." She rubbed her face. "The counts were filed. I'd stake my life on it, and Petrov saw the dues were current, and no colony pays its dues on time for 90 years and then forgets to file a census 3 times running. But the filings went to the standing registry, and the registry's record of them is sealed, and the registrar who sealed it is drinking Karen wine on a Karen estate, and I have no standing to break that seal and no proof it holds what I think it holds, which is where I've been stuck for 3 nights, and where I'm going to stay, unless—" She stopped, because Petrov had put down his coffee very carefully, and gone still, and gotten the look of a man watching something surface out of deep water. "Say the thing about the census again," Petrov said. "The writ claims Taurith failed to file its population counts. I need proof the counts were filed, and I can't get past the seal." "You don't need the registry's copy," Petrov said slowly. "We have our own." The mess went quiet. "Our tasking," Petrov said. He was already pulling the ship's log up on his slate, hands not quite steady. "Sabine, our tasking at Taurith, what was it?" Wellness pass and charter audit, Sabine said, and then she understood, and the understanding went through her like cold water. Oh, Petrov. A charter audit, Petrov said to Inez, is exactly what it sounds like. When a provisional survey ship gets sent to audit a colony's charter, the first thing it does, the first thing before it ever makes surface contact, is pull the world's full charter file from the nearest relay and verify it. Dues, bonds, filings, census, all of it. It's the boring part. It's the part nobody wants. It's why they send it to us. He turned the slate around and his voice had gone rough. I pulled Taurith's charter file the hour we dropped out of jump, 61 days ago. Before we ever found the cistern, before any of us knew there was a child. It's a routine audit pull, authenticated by the relay, time-stamped, sealed with the registry's own authentication key. Because that's how audit pulls work, the registry signs them so a colony can't forge a clean audit. It's sitting in our survey logs right now. And it has in it the registry's own acknowledgement receipts for Taurith's last 3 census filings. On time, all 3. He looked up. They sealed the registry's copy in ease. They retired the registrar. They scrubbed everything they could reach. But they couldn't scrub the copy that was already sitting in a Terran survey ship's logs before anybody knew the ship would matter. We've had the proof the whole time. We pulled it doing the chore. For a long moment, nobody at the table moved. Then Inez Delgado began, very quietly, to laugh, a cracked, disbelieving, wet-eyed laugh, and she put both hands flat on the table as if to keep herself in her chair. The chore, she said, 50 years of doing the Concord's chores, every dull audit, every thankless pass. Aldous Farr said men died for the seat out here doing the boring work, believing it meant something. She wiped her eyes with the heel of one hand. It meant this. Every audit any human ship ever ran, authenticated and time-stamped and stone-honest, sitting in a log nobody thought was worth corrupting, because who bothers to fake the homework of a species that only does homework? Petrov, get me that pull. Get me the authentication chain. Get me every timestamp. Because Vel Sorin built his whole life on the certainty that the only copy of the truth was one he could reach. And he was wrong. And the reason he was wrong is that he never once imagined the people who'd catch him would be the ones too junior to matter and too honest to cheat. The Karen moved that night, because the Karen had spent 400 years learning to feel a case slipping, and Vel Sorin had felt this one slip the moment a provisional survey ship refused to hand over a stray. The marshals in the passage received a new order at the 3rd hour of the station's night, a supplemental custody directive, issued not by the deputy but by the standing registry itself, over the executor's petition, citing credible indication of flight risk and evidentiary interference by the recovering vessel. It ordered the immediate transfer of the recovered person to secure court holding, pending the bench's ruling, custody of the vessel revoked. Tomas Reyes was awake when it happened, because Tomas Reyes was always awake now, sitting the night watch outside Nissa's berth with his back against the bulkhead, and he was the first to see the 2 marshals straighten off the wall and turn toward the door. "Hey," he said, getting to his feet. "Hey, what's happening?" "The vessel's custody is revoked," the nearer marshal said, not unkindly, and it was the same one who had almost smiled at his coffee, and it did not look at him now. "The person is to be transferred to secure holding. Step aside, please. This is a lawful order. Do not obstruct it." "No," Tomas said, and put his back against the door. He was 23. He was a survey tech. He had never in his life stood in the way of anything, and the 2 shapes in front of him were peace officers of the whole Concord, and every reasonable cell in his body told him to move. He did not move. He thought of the recording locked in his files, the high liquid thread of a lullaby somebody sang before the furrows, and he did not move. "I'll call the captain," he said. "I'll call the captain and the advocate, and you can serve your order on them, and they can protest it through the proper channels, and you don't have to do this right now in the middle of the night, dragging a sleeping kid out of the one bed she trusts. Whatever the order says, it doesn't say it has to be cruel. Wake me a captain. Give her 10 minutes. That's all I'm asking. 10 minutes and the right people in the room." The marshal was quiet for a moment. Down the passage, doors were opening. Petrov, at ease, the off-watch, roused by voices, filling the corridor the way they had filled it for far, a wall that was not quite a wall. And then the berth door opened behind Tomas, and Nissa came out. She had never opened that door herself before. She came out into the passage on her own 2 feet, small and silver in the ship's night lighting, and she walked past Tomas's legs and stopped in front of the 2 marshals and looked up at them. Not still now, not hiding, but looking with those enormous dark eyes up into the faces of the creatures who had come to take her. And she reached up with one small hand, and she did the thing she did, touched the nearer marshal's carapace once, testing, the way she had touched Sabine's cheek in the dark of the cistern, learning whether it would burn her. And then she took her hand back and she turned and she walked to Tomas, and she raised her arms to be picked up, and she put her face against his neck, and in the silence of the passage, in front of the marshals and the crew and the whole watching weight of the law, she began, very softly, to sing. It was the lullaby, the one from the recording, the one somebody sang before the furrows. She sang it into the young man's neck, small and steady, the way a person sings to keep from being afraid, and the sound of it filled the passage, and the 2 marshals of the Concord of Standing Law stood in front of a singing child they had been ordered to carry away, and did not move. The nearer one spoke first, and its careful trade standard had gone strange and thick. "We will note," it said, "that the transfer could not be effected without force, and that the use of force against the person, given the person's condition, exceeded the necessity of the order." It stepped back from the door. "We will report the order as impracticable pending clarification. The person remains with the vessel." It looked for one moment at the child singing into the crook of the young man's neck, and then it looked away down the passage at nothing. "We are peace officers," it said, to no one. "There is a word in our own tongue for the thing that order asked. It does not translate. It is not a good word." And the 2 of them went back to the wall and took up their station and stood their watch, but they stood it now, Tomas would swear, for the rest of his life, facing outward, toward the passage, toward anything else that might come down it, and not toward the door. Sorin came to the ship himself the next morning, and that, more than the failed transfer, told Sabine how frightened the Karen had become. He came without marshals and without advocates, alone, in a plain traveling robe rather than the oyster gray of his house, and he asked, through the ardent's calm, with great courtesy, whether the master of the vessel would grant him the favor of a private word. Inez said no before Sabine could speak, said it flatly, said that nothing good had ever come to a losing party from a private word with a Karen, that whatever he wanted to say he could say in the well where the record could hear it. And Sabine overruled her, because she had spent 19 years in rooms with people who meant her harm, and she had learned that you find out more about what a man is afraid of by letting him talk than by any amount of refusing to hear him. They met in the mess, the 2 of them and Inez, who would not leave, and Sorin sat at the crew table with his long pale hands folded and did not touch the coffee that Tomas, out of the same stubborn refusal to treat an enemy as less than a guest, set in front of him. "I will not waste your time with the law," Sorin said. "You have an advocate for that, and she is better than I expected, which I say as a compliment she will not want from me. I have come to speak to you as the person who actually holds the child, because, in my experience, the law is a thing that happens between advocates, and the real decisions are always made by someone who is simply tired and holding something and would like to put it down." He inclined his head. "I have come to help you put it down without anyone having to lose." "Go on," Sabine said. "The correction need not proceed. I have more discretion in this than my filings suggest. A petitioner may withdraw a petition, quietly for cause, and no bench will inquire too closely into the cause if the withdrawal tidies a matter the Concord would rather not have looked at." He turned one hand over, a gesture of reasonable men reaching a reasonable arrangement. "I will withdraw the correction. The child lives." In exchange, she is removed, not to my custody. I understand how that sounds, and I am not a monster, whatever your advocate believes, but to a neutral holding. A quiet world far out under a party trusted by no one and therefore trusted by everyone. She is cared for. She is safe. She is simply elsewhere and unrecorded and no longer a document with your flag on it. Your earth keeps its seat. Your captain keeps her conscience. You did not hand her to her executioners. You placed her in safety. Everyone lives. Everyone wins. It is the outcome a wise person reaches when the alternative is to gamble a child's life and a species' future on a bench that has never once ruled the way you need it to. The mess was quiet. Inez had gone very still, and Sabine understood why, because it was a good offer, a genuinely tempting offer, the most dangerous thing the man had said in 60 days. It saved the child. It saved the seat. It cost only that Nissa would vanish, go out to some far quiet world, unrecorded elsewhere, and grow up among strangers who had been paid to keep her, and never again be a daughter of anyone, never again be on anyone's manifest under anyone's hand, never again be a thing the record had to answer for. She would be alive. She would simply be nobody's. And a tired person, holding something heavy, could tell herself that alive and nobody's was a mercy, and put the weight down and feel wise about it. You want her disappeared, Sabine said. I want her safe, Soren said, and I want this matter closed, and I am honest enough to tell you that those two wants are the same want from where I sit, and I do not expect you to care about my wants. Care about hers. She is a child. What she needs is not a place in a record. It is a warm room and enough to eat and someone to keep the dark off her. I am offering all three, and no one need ever say the word correction again. Your advocate will tell you it is a trick. It is not a trick. It is simply the arrangement powerful people make when they have decided that a small thing is not worth the cost of a large fight. I have made it 40 times. It is the most merciful version of my work, and I am offering you its best form, and I would ask you, Captain, before your advocate answers for you, what does the child gain by staying a document? What does she gain by being fought over in a great room at the risk of her life so that your species can prove a point about who it is? Take the safe world. Let her be a person in a warm room instead of a principal in a cold one. And there it was, the whole of it, the exact shape of the thing that had put 40 worlds into the dark, laid on the crew table of a survey ship in the warm, reasonable voice of a man who believed every word. Sabine sat with it. She let herself feel how tempting it was, because she had learned long ago that the temptations you refuse to feel are the ones that get you. You're asking what she gains by being a person in a record, she said finally, instead of a person in a warm room, and you've asked it 40 times, and 40 times somebody tired, holding something heavy, couldn't answer you and put the weight down. She leaned forward. Here's the answer, executor, and I'm sorry no one's ever given it to you, because you've clearly needed to hear it for 400 years. The record is the warm room. That's the thing you've never understood, sitting on top of the whole galaxy's law and never once feeling what it's for. A warm room on a quiet world lasts exactly as long as the party you paid to keep her stays paid, and then she's astray again, on a world with no flag, and the next writ comes for the next quiet thing, and there's no line anywhere with her name on it to make anyone answer. But a person in the record, a daughter on a manifest, a citizen in a charter, a name a court had to say out loud, that's a room no one can unpay. That's the only warm room that holds. You've spent your life taking people out of the record and calling it mercy, and every one of them died anyway, later quietly off the books, because the thing that actually keeps the dark off a child is not a paid stranger on a far world. It's being someone the record has to answer for. She stood. She stays a document. She stays my daughter on my manifest under my hand in the great room in the light at whatever risk. Because the day she's safe and nobody's is the day she's exactly as dead as your machines wanted her, just slower. Withdraw your petition or don't. We'll see you in the well. Velsarin looked at her for a long moment, and something moved behind his composed, pale face that might, in a younger creature, have been the beginning of doubt. And then it was gone, folded away with 400 years of practice. "You will lose," he said, rising, "and she will pay for your point about who your species is. I have given you the merciful version. Remember, when the marshals come, that I offered it." He left the coffee untouched on the table and went, unhurried, down the ramp. That, Inez said, when the airlock had cycled, was the most dangerous thing he could have done, and you just walked through it. He'll never make that offer again. He'll finish this in the well now hard because you've made it personal. She was already reaching for her slate. "Which means we finish it in the well too. Get me everything Petrov's found. We are done being offered mercy. We're going to go get some." The bench reconvened the gallery before Inez Delgado could file. That was the Karen's last clean move, and it was a good one. Inez had spent the night building the motion, a petition to vacate the writ of quietus ab initio on the ground of fraud in its procurement, with the Ardent's authenticated audit pull attached as the registry's own signed proof that Talrith had filed its census counts on time. And she had it drafted and sealed and ready to enter at the 9th hour. And at the 8th hour the summons came that the bench had reached its ruling on the first standing question and would deliver it at once. "He knows," Inez said, throwing things into her case. "Sorin knows we've found something. He doesn't know what, but he can feel it, and he's doing the only thing he can. He's racing to get the correction affirmed on the question that's already before the bench, the Article 3 question, the one he owns. Once correction's affirmed, the matter's ruled. He'll argue my fraud motion comes too late, that it's a collateral attack on a settled ruling, that the evidence window's closed. He wants the gavel down before I can put the pull in front of anyone." She snapped the case shut. "So we go, and we try to enter it, and he tries to stop us, and we find out whether 400 years of school has taught that bench anything at all." They did not make it in. The gallery of standing was already ruling when the human party reached the doors, and the marshals held them at the threshold, not the two from the ship, other marshals, station marshals, because a bench in the act of delivering a ruling could not be interrupted by a party seeking to enter new matter, and that was the rule, and the rule was being used exactly as it had been used for 400 years, to keep the truth on the wrong side of a door until it was too late for the truth to matter. So they were in the aisle, held at the rail, when Arbiter Loma of Toulouse's voice filled the great round chamber, and the word it carried was death. Correction is affirmed. The standing error known provisionally as the Talrith juvenile is to be dissolved by lawful means within one cycle of this ruling. Inez had heard the argument lost 100 ways in 100 rooms, and she had thought she was armored against this one, and she was not. She heard the ruling land, and she heard, beneath it, the 200 years of Ves and the 40 worlds and the whole patient edifice closing over the child's head like water over a drain, and she opened her mouth to enter her motion, and a marshal's hand came up flat in front of her, and the words died. On the floor of the well, small in the cone of light, Nissa turned her head toward the human voices at the rail, and Sabine, who had carried her in, who had knelt beside her, who was on her feet now with a marshal at each arm, said the only word she had left. "No." The rest of it went exactly as it had to go. They removed the captain. They did it gently, because there was no anger in the room, only procedure, and they walked her up the aisle while she kept her eyes on the child, and the great doors sealed, and high in the topmost tier a cluster of oyster-gray shapes watched it happen, and Executor Velsorin inclined his long pale head toward the captain as she was carried past below him, the nod of a man acknowledging a game well played by an opponent who has nonetheless lost. He was wrong about the last part. He did not yet know he was wrong, but the nod was the single most expensive gesture of his 400-year career, because Inez Delgado saw it, saw the certainty in it, the ease, the settled and untroubled grace of a man who believed the matter was closed, and something in her that had been bending for 3 nights stopped bending and became, instead, a fixed and terrible resolve. "1 cycle," she said in the corridor to Sabine, who stood white and rigid with a marshal's grip fading from her arm. "He gave us 1 cycle. He thinks it's the time it takes to end her. It's the time we've got to end him." She was already moving. "A ruling on the merits can't be reopened by a party who disagrees with it." But a ruling procured by fraud isn't a ruling. It's a fraud wearing a ruling's clothes, and the conquered's own first standing gives any soul in standing the right to move to vacate a fraud at any time, before any bench, and it cannot be time-barred because the record shall answer to the world. Article 2. They can close the evidence window on an argument. They cannot close it on a lie, because a lie in the record is a wound in the record, and a wound in the record is the one thing this whole court exists to heal. She stopped at a comm station and began to key fast. "I'm filing the motion to vacate. Right now. Publicly. On the open Concord channel, not the sealed docket, so that Soren can't bury it and the bench can't quietly deny it in a back room. And then I'm going to do the thing you told me to do on the first night, Captain, the thing I said wasn't law." She looked up. "I'm going to make the room look, all of it, every world watching, because we don't have 1 cycle to win a legal argument. We have 1 cycle to make it impossible for 800 delegates to let a writ they now know is a lie kill a child in front of the whole galaxy. That's not law either, but you were right. It's the thing law is for." The motion to vacate went out on the open channel at the 10th hour, and by the 12th it had done something no filing in the Concord's history had ever done, which was travel. Inez had attached everything, the writ of quietus with its claim of census default. The Arden's audit poll, 61 days old, authenticated by the Standing Registry's own key, showing the 3 census filings acknowledged on time. The timestamps. The authentication chain. And because she had understood at last that this was not a legal fight but a human one, she had attached the recording, Tomas's recording, the high liquid thread of a lullaby a Sevani mother sang to her child before the machines came and combed her world down to bedrock and carried the soil away. She attached it without comment. She did not need a comment. She let 800 delegates, and behind them the watching worlds, hear the song and read the receipts and understand, in whatever organ each of them used for understanding, that the record said this child's people had abandoned their world and vanished, and that the record was a lie, and that the truth was a mother singing to her baby right up until the hour a legal instrument declared them both to have never existed. It moved. That was the thing none of them had predicted, the thing 400 years of Karen patience had never had to reckon with, because in 400 years no one had ever fought a writ of quietus in the light with the truth in hand. Small delegations that had never spoken on a correction matter began to speak. Worlds that had themselves gone quietly into the common stock, that had swallowed their own reclamations because there was nothing to be done, found that there was suddenly something to be done, and did it, filed statements in support, demanded the audit be verified, asked aloud on the record how many of the other 39 had been census defaults too, and whether anyone had ever checked and why not. And it reached Earth. Sabine had not expected that to matter. Earth was 9 days out by the fastest relay and a provisional signatory besides, its voice worth little in the gallery, its whole standing wagered already on this one fight. But the trial had gone out on the open channel, and the open channel reached the relays, and the relays reached home, and a species that did the Concord's chores and was grateful for the chance discovered, all at once and all together, that one of its own survey ships was standing between a 70 child and a machine that meant to unmake her, and that the price of the standing was Earth's own seat, and that a court of the whole galaxy had voted the child dead on a document Earth's people could prove was a lie. Humanity, it turned out, had an opinion about that. It came back up the relay in a flood the legation's comms could not hold. Not a government's careful statement, but a species' raw voice. 10,000 messages, and then 100,000, from people who had never heard of Talrith and would never see the black, ordinary people who had only just learned that a small silver child was alone in a room full of robes with a human captain kneeling beside her, and who had, without anyone organizing it. Arrived at a single unanimous and thunderously simple conclusion, which they said in 10,000 different ways, and which all meant the same thing. She's ours, you don't get to. Aldous Farr brought the formal instrument aboard the Arden himself, at the 16th hour of the one cycle, and his hands were not steady, and his careful diplomat's face had something in it that Sabine had not seen there before, which was a kind of fierce and disbelieving pride. The home government convened in emergency session, he said. All of it, every block. I have never seen a vote like it, and I never will again. He set the datapad on the mess table with great care, as if it were made of something that could break. Earth has extended a formal grant of kinship and citizenship to the recovered person, executed under Terran law, entered into the Terran registry, effective immediately and irrevocably. Nyssa of Talrith is a citizen of Earth and a daughter of the human species, claimed and recorded and owned. And the instrument declares, I'm reading it, Captain, I'm reading it exactly, that any power which harms her harms a human child, and will answer to humanity as such in this court or out of it, now and for as long as we endure. He looked up, and his eyes were wet, and he did not seem ashamed of it. The legation's instruction is rescinded. There is no more talk of proportionality. The review can burn, the seat can burn, 50 years can burn. The government's instruction is one line, Captain, and I have waited my whole career to carry an instruction like it, and I did not know that until an hour ago. He almost laughed. It says, bring our daughter home. Sabine looked at the datapad on the table, and then down the passage, toward the berth where a small silver child slept with a young man's fingers in her fist. A citizen of Earth now, a daughter of a species she had never seen, claimed by 10,000 strangers who had heard her mother's song on an open channel, and decided all at once that she was theirs. She's not going to understand what any of this means, Sabine said quietly. No, Farr agreed, but someday she will, and when she does, she'll know that a whole species she'd never met stood up in a room and said her name and refused to sit down. That's a thing to know about the people you belong to. He straightened. Advocate Delgado has moved to vacate. Earth has claimed her. The truth is on the open channel and the whole Concord is choking on it. But the ruling stands and the cycle is running, and unless that bench reconvenes and vacates its own order, the marshals come for her at the cycle's end regardless of how loud the galaxy is. He looked at Sabine. Can Delgado make them reconvene? She can make them, Sabine said. The question was never whether she could make them look. It's what they do once they can't look away. She stood. Get the child ready, Mr. Farr. Wherever this ends, it ends in that room, and it ends with her in it because they are not going to vote on whether my daughter lives without looking at her face while they do it. Not this time. Not in the light. The bench reconvened the gallery at the 20th hour of the cycle, because Inez Delgado had left it no other lawful choice, and the great round chamber was fuller than it had been for any correction in living memory. Delegations that had never troubled to attend a writ matter filled their tiers. The galleries above the galleries, reserved for observers, were dense with shapes. And on the open channel, unseen but present in the mind of every soul in the room, 100 worlds watched, because Inez had put the truth where it could not be unseen, and a court that had done its work in the dark for 400 years was going to do this piece of it in a light so total that no shadow anywhere in the Concord could hold a lie. Nyssa came in as she had before in Sabine's arms, small and silver against the captain's chest, but she came in now as a citizen of Earth and a daughter of the human species, and though not one delegate in the room could have said what that meant to a human, every one of them had heard the instrument read on the open channel, had heard a whole young species stand up and claim her, and the knowledge changed the weight of the small body in the well. She was not a remnant now. She was a border. To reach her, the law would have to cross into a place. A species had drawn a line around and dared the galaxy to enter. Executor Vel Sorin rose first, as was his right as petitioner, and Sabine, kneeling in the well with her hand on her daughter's back, watched him rise and understood that the ease had gone out of him. It was a small thing. His robe hung as perfectly as ever, his long head was as composed, but he had felt the room. 400 years of feeling rooms, and this one had turned, and he knew it. And he did the only thing a master of his craft could do, which was to stop defending the ground he had lost and attack the ground the human stood on. "Arbiter," he said, and the beautiful instrument of his voice was as warm as ever. "The Terran advocate has filed a motion to vacate, alleging fraud in the procurement of the writ of quietus, and she has attached to it a document she represents to be an authenticated audit of Talrith's charter, purporting to show that the census filings the writ found in default were in fact timely made. I will not insult this bench by arguing that fraud, if proven, would not void the writ. It would. That is settled law, and I stand on it as readily as she does." He turned slowly to the tiers. "I will argue something simpler, that the document is worthless. It is produced at the 11th hour by the very vessel that has fought this correction from the first day, a vessel whose master has openly refused lawful orders, concealed the recovered person, and now, conveniently, discovers in her own logs the one piece of evidence that would undo a ruling she could not undo by argument. It is a provisional signatory's private file, offered by an interested party, at the exact moment of her defeat. I do not say the captain forged it. I say only this, that the conquered does not vacate the settled rulings of its highest bench on the unverified say-so of the losing party's own paperwork. Authenticate it, truly, independently, against the registry's master key, before this bench and not on the losing party's word, or set it aside. The record answers to the world. It does not answer to a survey ship's convenient logs. It was, Inez thought, exactly the right move, and for one cold moment she was afraid, because he had found the seam, the one place where the human's honesty could be made to look like its opposite, where the very fact that the proof came from them could be turned into the reason to doubt it. If the audit poll could not be independently verified, here, now in the open, then it was one interested party's word, and a fixed bench would seize the excuse gratefully and set it aside, and the cycle would run out, and the marshals would come. She had known he would say this. She had spent the 18th and 19th hours making sure that when he did, she would be ready. "The executor is right," Inez said, rising, and for the second time in that chamber she gave the room the small shock of an advocate conceding. "The bench should not vacate a ruling on my word or the captain's or the Ardent's logs alone. He is entirely correct, so let us not ask it to." She turned to the arbiter. "The audit poll carries the standing registry's own authentication key, the key the registry uses to sign every audit it issues, precisely so that no colony and no ship can forge a clean charter record. That key is not mine. It is not the captain's. It is the registry's, held by the registry, verifiable by the registry, here in this room, in front of this bench and every world watching. I do not ask you to trust the document. I ask you to do the one thing the Karen have spent 400 years making sure no one ever did." She lifted her chin. "Check it. Bring the registry's master key to this well and check the signature on the Ardent's audit against it, live, in the open, and let the Concord's own machinery tell this gallery whether the census receipts in that poll are genuine. If they are forged, my motion fails and I will withdraw it on my knees, and the captain will surrender her ward, and I will have wasted this court's time and earned its contempt. If they are genuine," she let it hang, "then the registry's own key will have told 800 delegates that the writ of quietus that dissolved Talrith was issued on a lie, and this bench will know it, and the watching worlds will know it, and there will be no shadow left anywhere in the Concord to put that knowledge back into." The gallery was utterly silent. And now the whole affair came down, as these things do, to a single old jurist in a high box, because the request Inez had made could be granted or denied only by the arbiter, and the arbiter alone. Loam of Tulu had presided over the gallery of standing for longer than the Terran species had known the Concord existed, And in all that time, the old hombre had believed one thing above every other thing, which was that the law was better than the people who used it. It was not a comfortable belief. Lomoftalu had watched the Karen acquire world after world through the flawless operation of the very instruments the founders had made to prevent exactly that, and had ruled, again and again, that the instruments were sound and the operation lawful, and had told itself each time that the law's coldness was the price of its fairness, that a law which could be moved by the suffering in a well was a law that could be moved by anything, by wealth, by fear, by the loudest voice, and that the only protection the small and the poor had was a law that did not feel, because a law that did not feel could not be made to feel differently for the strong. It had ruled Vest that way when it was younger. It had told itself the ruling was the hard mercy of a fair machine. And now a provisional captain had knelt in its well beside a singing child, and a junior advocate had stood beside them and said that the ruling in Vest was the greatest error in the history of conquered law, and the terrible thing, the thing Lomoftalu had carried alone through the deliberation, and could no longer set down, was that the old jurist had come, somewhere in 400 years of ruling for the record and against the world, to suspect that she was right. The Terran advocate had not asked the bench to feel, that was the thing, she had asked the bench to check. She had taken the court's own coldness, its own worship of the authenticated record over the beating truth, and she had turned it around and offered it back and said, "You love the record above the world. Very well. Then let the record speak truly in the open and abide what it says." It was the one request Lomoftalu could not refuse without confessing that the court had never loved the record at all, that it had loved only the rulings the record could be made to yield, and had looked away, always, from the record it did not wish to read. The executor of the Karen was watching the bench with the stillness of a creature that has staked everything on a door staying shut. Lomoftalu understood at last and completely that the door had never been the record. The door had been the bench, all along 400 years of jurists trained in Karen-endowed houses to believe that the record was closed, so that no one would ever ask to open it. The record had been ready to speak the whole time. It was only the court that had agreed not to listen. "Bring the master key," said the arbiter of the concord of standing law. A sound went through the gallery, not a gasp. The conquered did not gasp, but a vast slow inrush, as of 800 delegates leaning forward at once. Across the well, Executor Vel Soren did not move, and his stillness was no longer the stillness of confidence. It was the stillness of a man watching a tide come in over ground he had believed was above the water line. "Arbiter," his voice was still beautiful. It cost him something now to keep it so. "The registry's master key is an instrument of grave consequence. To bring it into open gallery, to verify a single party's document under the eyes of unauthenticated observers, sets a precedent that will." "The precedent," said Lomoftalu, "is that the record answers to the world. It is written in the first standing, Article 2. I have read it aloud at the opening of every session I have presided over for 400 years, and I find, Executor, that I have never once been asked to mean it. Bring the key." They brought the key. It came into the well carried by the registrar of the day, a nervous plated official who plainly wished to be anywhere else, and the verification was done there on the floor of the chamber live, on the great display that ringed the well so that every tier and every watching world could see it. The Arden's audit pull opened, its authentication block laid bare, the registry's master key applied to it by the registry's own official under the arbiter's own eye. It was not dramatic to watch. It was a column of characters resolving against another column of characters, a machine confirming a signature, the dullest possible procedure, the exact kind of boring verification a provisional survey ship performed 1,000 times a tour because it was the chore no one else would do. The match came up green and held, and the registrar of the day looked at it and looked again, and then spoke in a voice that carried to the ceiling, because the whole chamber had gone so silent that a whisper would have carried. "The signature is genuine," the registrar said. "The document is a true audit issued and authenticated by the Standing Registry 61 days ago. The census receipts it contains are genuine registry acknowledgments. The holding of Talrith filed its population counts, on time, all 3 cycles." The plated official set the key down as if it had grown heavy. "The writ of quietus found a census default that did not exist. There was no default. There was no lapse. Under the record's own authenticated hand, the holding of Talrith never lawfully dissolved." The word never went through the gallery of standing like a crack running through ice. Never not dissolved. It meant that Talrith had been, on the day the reclamation machines came over its day side and combed its settlements down to bedrock, a living chartered world of the conquered in full and lawful standing, 40,000 souls under the conquered's own protection, and that the machines had come anyway, on the strength of a writ that lied, and that everyone who had signed it and countersigned it and stamped it and looked away from it had presided over the destruction of a conquered world and called it housekeeping. It meant that the small silver child in the well was not a remnant of a dissolved population. She was a surviving citizen of a chartered world, with every particle of standing the charter conferred, and always had been, and the 400 years of law that said otherwise had been 400 years of reading a forged document as if it were true. Executor Velsorin rose into that silence, and Sabine watched him do it, and understood that she was watching something she would never see again. A master of an ancient and terrible craft playing the last card of a hand that had already lost, because a man like that did not stop, could not stop, would go on making lawful moves until there was no board left to move on. "Arbiter," he said, and it took the whole of his 400 years to keep the beauty in his voice. "The document is authenticated. I accept it. The Karen Ascendancy accepts it. If the writ was procured in error, the Ascendancy will of course cooperate fully with any inquiry, and any question of the reversion, the sale, the reclamation itself, becomes a matter for the proper proceedings, in their proper time." He turned smoothly to the tiers, retreating to the one patch of ground he had left. "But I would remind this bench that the correction now under challenge was not affirmed on the writ alone. It was affirmed on the question of first standing, on the settled law that standing flows from the record, and that the recovered person, whatever the status of Talrith, held no vested standing of her own. That ruling is separate and settled, and the fraud in the writ, grave as it is, does not disturb it. And the Terran claim of kinship fails on the same ground it failed before. The Terran signatory is provisional. Provisional kinship does not vest, and a provisional species cannot, by its own excited decree, manufacture standing for a being the record does not recognize. The bench has ruled on this. Fraud in the writ is a matter for another day. The correction should. No, executor, it was not the arbiter who said it. It was Inez Delgado, and she said it quietly, and she did not rise, because she had understood at last that the loudest thing in that room was the truth, and that she no longer needed to raise her voice above it. "You've lost the board. Let me show you where. The first standing ruling held that the recovered person had no vested standing of her own, that she was a remnant of a dissolved population, and remnants don't vest. But there was no dissolved population. The writ is void ab initio. It never stood. Which means Talrith was never dissolved, which means on the day this child was found she was not a remnant of anything. She was a living, chartered citizen of a living, chartered, conquered world, holding the full standing that world's charter conferred, exactly as she had held it since the day she was born. There is no first standing question anymore. There is no interpretation to argue. You needed her to be a remnant for the standing question to even exist, and the record's own key has just told this gallery that she never was one. She let that land, and then she said the last of it gently, almost kindly. You spent 400 years making sure no one ever checked the record, executor, because you knew that the record, honestly read, protected exactly the people you were selling. It was never a weak law. It was a strong law you'd blinded. She doesn't need Earth's claim to survive this room. She's a citizen of a conquered world in full standing, and this court's whole duty is to protect her and always was. She glanced at the small silver child in the well, and something in her hard face gentled. But she has Earth's claim anyway, because a whole species heard her mother's song on an open channel and stood up and said her name. And whatever this court decides about vesting and provisional standing, that happened, and it can't be unhappened. And I think, Arbiter, that it is the most important thing that has happened in this chamber in 400 years, and I would ask the record to answer to it. High in the ombre box, Loam of Tulu was quiet for a long moment. Then the old arbiter of the concord of standing law did the thing that no Karen endowment and no 400 years of school had ever prepared a bench to do, which was to rule for the world. The bench finds the writ of quietus concerning the holding of Talrith void from the moment of its issuance, procured by a false claim of census default, contradicted by the standing registry's own authenticated record. The consensus voice filled the chamber, and it did not falter. A void writ dissolves nothing. The holding of Talrith was, at all relevant times, a chartered world of this concord in full standing, and its people were, at all relevant times, citizens under this concord's protection. The reclamation of a living chartered world is not reclamation. The bench will not name today what it was. The bench will only find that it was unlawful in its every particular, and refer the whole of it, the writ, the reversion, the sale, the machines, and every signature that touched them, to the standing inquiry, with the direction that the inquiry examine not only Talrith but every reclamation effected by the Karen ascendancy under a writ of quietus in the 400 years of the instrument's use, and report to the full concord what it finds, however long that answering takes and wherever it leads. The stalks bent slowly toward the well. As to the recovered person, there is no recovered person. There is a surviving citizen of the chartered world of Talrith, holding full standing since birth, who was found by a Terran vessel and given care. The order of correction is vacated. The sentence is a nullity. It ought never to have been spoken, and this bench, which spoke it, will carry that. Sabine, kneeling in the well, felt Nissa's small hand tighten in hers, and did not trust herself to move. "One matter remains," said Loam of Tulu, and the bench addresses it, though it was not, strictly, required to be reached, because the bench has come to believe that some things ought to be said in the light while the light is on them. The old head turned toward the highest tier, toward the Terran advocate, toward the kneeling captain and the child. The Terran species has entered into its own registry, an instrument of kinship, claiming this citizen of Talrith as a daughter of humanity, and declaring that any power which harms her harms a human child and will answer to humanity as such. The bench was invited to rule on whether a provisional signatory may vest such kinship. The bench declines to rule, and will tell the gallery honestly why. It is because the bench does not wish to be the body that tells a young species its love for a child is provisional. Humanity claimed her. It did so loudly, and at cost to itself, and against its own interest, and the bench has watched a great many powers in this chamber act against a child's interest at no cost to themselves and call it law, and it finds that it prefers the human's way, and will not use the machinery of standing to make their claims smaller than they meant it. Let the record answer to it. The record will say that a child of a wronged world was claimed by a species that had nothing to gain by claiming her, and that the concord of standing law, for once, did not stand in the way. We are adjourned. The gavel tone sounded through the gallery of standing, and for the first time in 400 years it did not close a door over someone. It opened one. Vel Soren did not look at the captain as he left the chamber. That was the thing Sabine noticed, in the long strange minutes after the adjournment. While the tiers emptied and delegations she had never met came down to the rail to look at the child and murmur things she could not understand and did not need to. The executor of the Karen gathered his oyster-gray robe and his advocates and went up the aisle without haste, exactly as unhurried as he had been on the first day, and he did not incline his long, pale head toward her, did not acknowledge the game, did not nod, and she understood that the nod had only ever been for a game he was winning, and that a man like that had no gesture at all for the other thing, because in 400 years he had never once needed one. He would not be punished the way the crew wanted him punished. Sabine understood that too, even then in the first hour. The standing inquiry would grind for years. The Karen were old and rich and patient, and they would fight it filing by filing, and some of the 40 worlds would never be answered for, and Vel Saren might well die of old age in a comfortable house before any tribunal reached him. That was not justice. Sabine had been a medic too long to believe that the world handed out justice. The world handed out consequences, unevenly, late, and to the wrong people as often as the right ones, and the most you could do was make sure the consequence landed at all somewhere, so that the next Vel Saren, contemplating the next quiet writ over the next poor world, would have to reckon with the memory of a full gallery watching a master of the craft walk out of a room he had lost. It was not enough. It was more than 40 worlds had ever gotten. She would take it and go on being angry about the rest for the rest of her life, and that too was the job. He did speak to her once, though, not in the chamber. In the long gray concourse outside it, where the delegations thinned and the observers dispersed, Sabine came around a pillar with the child asleep on her shoulder and found Vel Saren waiting, alone, his advocates sent ahead, his oyster-gray robe as perfect as it had been on the first day. She stopped. She did not have anything she wanted to say to him, and she was too tired to pretend otherwise, and so she simply stood with her daughter's weight warm against her neck and waited to find out what he wanted. "You think you have beaten something today," he said. There was no heat in it. There was, if anything, a kind of weariness, as if he were explaining a thing to a junior he did not expect to understand. "You have not. You have won one file. One world, out of a galaxy of worlds too poor and too far to keep their own records in a stranger's hold. There will be more writs, Captain. There will be more quiet corrections on more empty worlds, and no survey ship will happen to have pulled the audit first, and no young species will happen to hear the song on an open channel, and it will all go on exactly as it has gone on, because the law is a machine and I am very good at the machine, and you are a woman with a child and a boat." He looked at the small silver head on her shoulder. "You have made yourself feel today that decency is a force in the world. It is not. It is a mood. It passes. The machine remains." Sabine considered him for a long moment. The child stirred against her neck and settled. "You may be right," she said at last. "I've thought about it a lot these 60 days, whether the decent thing is just a mood that passes, whether the machine wins in the end no matter what any one person does. And you might be right. But here's the thing you got wrong, Executor, and you got it wrong because you're 400 years old and you've forgotten how it works." She shifted the child higher on her shoulder. "You said no survey ship will happen to have pulled the audit first. But every survey ship pulls the audit first. That's the job. That's the boring, thankless, unpaid job that a whole species does because we were grateful to be allowed to do the chores. And every one of those audits is sitting in a log right now, honest and time-stamped and signed, in a hold you can't reach, on a boat crewed by people too junior to matter and too stubborn to cheat. You didn't lose one file today. You showed the whole galaxy where 400 years of the truth has been sitting the entire time, waiting for someone to check. There isn't going to be another quiet correction. There's going to be an inquiry that reads every audit any human ship ever pulled, against every writ your house ever filed, and I don't think you're going to like what the boring people find." She stepped past him. "You said decency is a mood that passes. Maybe. But the record is forever, and we kept ours honest when it didn't matter, and now it does. That's not a mood, Executor. That's a receipt. Enjoy the machine." She did not look back to see his face. She had learned over 60 days that the men who ran that particular machine had no gesture for the other thing, and she did not need to watch him fail to find one. The Terran review was withdrawn before the Ardent left threshold. It was withdrawn quietly, through the proper channels, the motion allowed to lapse without a vote, because the delegations that had entered it had discovered, in the space of a single cycle, that being associated with the Karen's 400-year housekeeping was no longer the safe and respectable thing it had been the week before, and that a provisional species which had stood up in open gallery and forced the record to answer to the world was suddenly a species a great many powers wished to be seen standing near. Aldous Farr brought the news aboard with an expression of profound and complicated feeling. "They're not just extending our provisional status," he told Sabine in the mess, while the crew pretended not to listen and listened to every word. "There's a motion early, informal but real, and it has weight behind it that it did not have a week ago to advance Earth to full signatory, a real seat, the thing 50 years of chores was supposed to buy and never quite did." He turned his cup in his hands. "The thing that would have burned if you'd handed her over, it didn't burn. It's closer now than it's ever been, and it's closer because you refused to trade her for it." He shook his head slowly. "I have spent 30 years believing that the way you win a seat at a table like this is by being useful and careful and never making anyone uncomfortable. And a survey captain won us more standing in one cycle by being gloriously, ruinously uncomfortable than I won in 3 decades of being useful. I don't know what to do with that, Captain. I think I'm going to have to change how I understand my whole profession." "Don't overthink it, Mr. Farr," Sabine said. "We didn't win the seat by being difficult. We won it by being the kind of people you'd want at your table when something like this happens to your children. That's all standing is in the end. It's other people deciding whether they'd want you in the room when it counts." She looked down the passage, toward the berth. "Turns out the answer's easier to earn by keeping a promise to one child than by 50 years of never causing trouble. Who knew?" "Not me," Farr admitted. "Not until this week." He rose to go and paused. "The inquiry's real too, they've seeded it. It's already sent for the audit logs of every human survey ship that's operated in the last 50 years, cross-referenced against every writ of quietus the Karen ever filed. It'll take years. It may take decades. But there are people on 19 reclaimed worlds who went into the common stock as census defaults, and some of them had survey passes in the years before, and some of those passes pulled audits, and those audits are in our holds." He was quiet a moment. "There may be others, Captain. Other survivors on other worlds that everyone agreed weren't there. The inquiry's going to go looking now. Because a boat full of junior people did the chore and kept the receipt." After he had gone, Adiz, who had been mending something at the far end of the mess and saying nothing, spoke without looking up. 19 worlds, she said. "You think there's more of them? More kids in more holes, waiting 3 months in the dark for somebody to fly a drone down?" "I think there probably are," Sabine said. Adiz nodded slowly and bit off her thread, and folded the mended thing in her lap with great care. "Then we'd better get the seat," she said, "and the inquiry and the whole loud, ugly business, because somebody's got to go looking, and I'd rather it was us than the machine." She stood. "I'm going to go check on our daughter." She said it plainly, without weight, the way you'd say you were going to check the coolant, and it was the first time any of them had said the word "our" about the child out loud, and nobody corrected her, because there was nothing to correct. The 2 marshals came to the ramp before the Ardent uncoupled, off-duty, out of the gray carapace of the peace service and into plain civilian drab, and they asked, through Tomas, whether they might say a word of farewell to the person. It was irregular. It was, Petrov pointed out, probably against 4 separate regulations. Sabine let them aboard anyway, because a creature that faces outward on a watch it was ordered to face inward has earned a word. They did not stay long. The nearer one crouched down to Nissa's eye level in the passage, the same passage where it had once stood ordered to carry her away, and it said something to her in its own tongue, low and careful, the word that did not translate, and Nissa read the chemistry of it and understood what the humans could not, and she reached up and touched its face once, the way she did, and this time it was not a test. It was a blessing, given the way her people gave them, and the marshal received it very still, and then it rose and left without looking back, because some things are too large to carry out of a room while anyone is watching your face. The ardent went home the long way, because home was 9 days out and the child had never seen the world that had claimed her, and Sabine had decided somewhere over the course of the affair that Nyssa would arrive at Earth as a daughter coming home, and not as evidence being delivered. She grew on that passage, not in size, that would take years, and Adese predicted, from what little the Concord's biology archives held on the 70, that Nyssa would be small for a long time yet, and slight and quick, and would keep her sense and her stillness and her habit of caching small treasures in the corners of whatever space she was given. But she grew in the way that mattered, which was that the terrible predator stillness came less often, and the singing came more, and she began to talk, really talk, in sentences now, a strange, careful trade standard threaded with 70 words the crew learned rather than let her lose. She began to ask questions. And it was the questions, more than anything, that told them she was coming back from the dark, because a creature that asks questions is a creature that has decided the future is a thing worth having information about. "Where do we go?" she asked Tomas, on the 6th day, sitting in the crook of the viewport with the stars sliding past, the two of them in the easy silence they had built out of 100 night watches. "Earth," Tomas said. "Home, our home. It's yours now, too." Nyssa considered this with the grave attention she brought to everything. "The big room," she said, and Tomas understood she meant the gallery, the well, the cone of light, the place she did not have words for and did not need them to remember. "The big room," said, "I am not a thing to fix." She said it carefully, testing each word the way she had once tested Sabine's cheek in the dark. Sabine said. The room said. "That's right," Tomas said, and his voice was not entirely steady. "The room said you're a person, and Earth said something more than that. Earth said you're one of us, one of ours." "Why?" Nyssa asked, not challenging, wanting the true answer the way children want the true answer because they can feel the false ones. And Tomas, who was 23, who had come out to the black to see wonders, and had found the only one that would ever matter to him sitting in a hole in the dark, thought about it for a while, because she deserved a true answer, and he was not going to give her a mood that passes. "Because a long time ago," he said slowly, "our people were small and far out and nobody important, and we figured out that the only way people like us ever get to be safe is if we decide that nobody is a thing to fix. Not us, not anybody. And it's easy to say that when it's cheap. Anybody says it when it's cheap. But you find out if a people actually believe it by what they do when it's expensive, when believing it costs them something they want, when it'd be easier and smarter and more grown-up to look away." He looked at the small silver child against the stars. "You were expensive, Nyssa. You cost us a whole lot. A whole species did the arithmetic and it came out wrong and they claimed you anyway. That's not because you're special. You'd hate it if it was because you're special, and you'd be right to. It's because if we'd have let them fix you, then we'd have been people who look away when it's expensive, and then the words don't mean anything, and then someday it's us in the hole and nobody comes." He nudged her gently. "So you're one of ours because you have to be. Because the day you're not is the day we're not who we said we were. You didn't get saved because you're a treasure, kid. You got saved because we are only who we are if we save you. It's the least romantic reason in the galaxy, and it's the only one that holds up when it's expensive. You understand?" Nyssa was quiet for a long time, watching the stars. "No," she said finally with Sevani honesty, "but I will keep it. And I will understand it later." And she took the words and put them away in the careful corner of herself, where she kept the things too valuable to lose, the bolt and the fuse and the ration wrapper, and now this. And Tomas understood that he had just been cached, that his answer had been judged treasure and hoarded against the future, and he had to look out the viewport for a while and not say anything at all. Earth met her at the dock, and the meeting was not the quiet family homecoming Sabine had planned, because a whole species had claimed a child on an open channel, and a whole species turned out to want to see her come home. They kept it from becoming a spectacle, barely, and only because Sabine flatly refused to carry her daughter out into a crowd like a trophy. But the concourse of the orbital station was lined, when the Ardent's crew came off the ramp, with more people than Sabine had ever seen gathered in one place off a screen. People who had heard the song, people who had sent one of the 100,000 messages, people who had, for a week, cared about a small silver child on the far side of the galaxy with an intensity that had surprised even them, and who had come now, quietly, keeping their distance because someone had asked them to, just to see. Just to be able to say, later, that they had been there when she came home, that they had been part of the species that stood up. There were children in that crowd. Sabine noticed human children, brought by parents who had wanted them to see it, hoisted onto shoulders and held up at the rail, small faces watching the small silver figure come down the ramp with an uncomplicated interest that had none of the law in it. To them, she was not a citizen of a wronged world or a nullity of a vacated sentence or a receipt in a species' honest ledger. She was a kid who had been lost and was now found, and they had come to see her the way children come to see anything lost and found, because it tells them something they need to know about the odds. Sabine watched the human children watch her daughter, and understood that this too was part of the price and part of the payment, that a generation of them would grow up having been held at a rail to witness a species keep an expensive promise, and would carry the memory of it into whatever rooms they inherited, and would be, because of it, a fraction harder to talk out of decency when the cost came due, as it always came due. That was worth a seat. That was worth 40 seats. Nyssa, in Sabine's arms, took in the crowd with her enormous dark eyes, and did not go predator still, and that Adiz said afterward, wiping her face and pretending it was the recycled air. That was the moment she knew the child was going to be all right. Because the old Nyssa, the sister Nyssa, would have vanished into that stillness at the sight of so many large creatures, and the new one looked at 10,000 strangers who had come to welcome her, and read the chemistry of them with the sense the humans didn't have, and found in it no aggression and no fear and no intent to harm. Found in it only the thing the 70 had no word for, and the humans had too many, the warm mammal chemistry of a crowd that means you well, and she did not hide. She lifted one small hand instead, and touched the air toward them, the way she had touched Sabine's cheek and the marshal's carapace and the world itself, testing whether it would burn her. It did not burn her. Nothing in that concourse would ever burn her again. And the crowd, 10,000 strangers who had claimed her, understood the gesture without being told what it meant, the way you understand some things in your chest before your head has the words, and 10,000 hands lifted in the vast quiet concourse and touched the air back toward the small silver child. And no one cheered, because it was not a cheering kind of moment, and the whole enormous room simply held its hand out to a daughter coming home and let her see that it was safe. Sabine stood at the bottom of the ramp with her child on her shoulder and her crew around her, and a species holding out its hand. And she thought about a cone of pale light falling into a dark room like water into a drain, and a voice full of the whole weight of the law saying that the thing in the light was an error to be dissolved. And she found that she was not angry anymore, not in that moment. Though the anger would come back, and she would need it for the inquiry and the 19 worlds, and all the holes still waiting to be checked. In that moment she only held her daughter and let her be seen. "Welcome home," she said into the silver hair. "This is yours, all of it. Every one of them." Nyssa put her face against her mother's neck, the way she did, and against the collarbone of the human who had come down into the dark and waited an hour and made a promise she had not known the price of and had paid it, every credit, without once counting the cost. The child began, very softly, to sing. The inquiry took 11 years. And it was still not finished when Nyssa of Talrith of Earth went back out into the black to do the thing she had decided, somewhere in the long growing up, that she had been kept alive to do. She was not small anymore, though she was slight and quick, and she had kept the sense and the stillness and the habit of caching small treasures in the corners of any space she was given. Her cabin aboard the survey cutter Second Promise was full of them. A bolt, a fuse, a worn data slate that no longer worked, and that she would not let anyone throw away because a young man named Tomas Reyes had used it 20 years before to make a little light jump from his hand to hers in the mess of a ship called the Ardent. Tomas was a captain himself now, of his own boat, running his own audits, keeping his own honest records in his own hold, and he and Nissa passed each other in the deep black once or twice a tour, and had a way of finding excuses to dock at the same stations, and the crews of both ships had long since stopped pretending not to understand that the two of them were family in a way that did not need a word the humans had. Sabine Orlov had retired at last to a small place on a coast where the water was the color of weak tea and reminded her, she said, of nothing in particular, and she had told a lie when she said it, and Nissa had let her have the lie, because some things you keep for the people you love. Adiz wrote to all of them, still, long unhurried letters full of the small news of a long life, and signed them always from your medic, which had become, over the years, a kind of title, the way the marshal on the Ardent had once said there was a word in his tongue for a thing that did not translate. The inquiry had found the others. That was the thing Nissa carried out into the black with her, the thing that had made her a survey captain, instead of the 100 other things a daughter of two species might have become. The inquiry, grinding through 11 years of human audit logs cross-referenced against 400 years of writs, had found that Talrith was not the only reclaimed world where the machines had missed a corner. There had been others. Not many. The machines were thorough, and the dark was patient, and most of the holes that had once held something small no longer did. But some. Over the 11 years, the inquiry's quiet referrals had reached a scatter of survey ships and aid vessels, and more than once, a single stubborn survey tech who would not stop looking at a thermal ghost, and those ships had flown their drones down into the dark of 19 reclaimed worlds, and they had, between them, brought up out of the holes a little over 200 survivors of populations the record had agreed were never there. 200 out of the hundreds of thousands the writs had unmade. It was not justice. Nissa had learned that from her mother, who had learned it from a life of pulling wounded people off floors that were trying to kill them. The world did not hand out justice. It handed out consequences, unevenly and late, and the most you could do was make sure the consequence landed somewhere. 200 children and elders and holdouts who should have been dead on the record and were instead alive on it, because a species too junior to matter had kept its receipts. It was not enough. It was more than the machine had ever meant to leave. And it needed somewhere to put them, and someone who understood the holes, and Nissa of Talrith had raised her hand. She went back to Threshold once in the 11th year, because the inquiry had asked her to speak, and because there was a thing she wanted to see. The gallery of standing had not changed. The great round chamber still held its 800 tiers, and the cone of pale ceiling light still fell into the well like water into a drain, and Nissa stood at the bottom of it, grown now, a citizen of two worlds, and looked up at the place from which an old jurist had once spoken a sentence of death over a child too small to be given the words for it. Loam of Toulouse was gone. The Ombri lived long but not forever, and the old arbiter had presided over the first 4 years of the inquiry it had ordered and had not lived to see the rest. Nissa had met it once near the end. It had looked at her for a long time with its slow stalked head, and it had said, in the flat consensus voice that had once condemned her, that it had ruled for the record against the world for 400 years and had been wrong every day of it, and that it had been given, at the very end of a long life, one chance to rule the other way, and that it counted that single ruling as the only worthwhile act of its whole tenure, and that it was grateful, in a way it did not have the words for either. That the chance had come while it still had the sense to take it. Nissa had told it that the room had said she was a person, and that she had kept that and understood it later, exactly as she'd promised the young man she would. The old jurist had bent its stalks in the complicated gesture the humans had never learned to read, and Nissa, who read chemistry and not gesture, had understood it anyway. She spoke to the inquiry. She told them about the cistern, and the 3 months in the dark, and the drone, and the human who had come down on a line with her helmet off, so that a frightened thing would see a face and not a machine, and had sat down a careful distance away and waited an hour and let the frightened thing decide. She told them about a manifest line, entered under a captain's hand on the day they found her, that had turned a piece of housekeeping into a thing a court had to call by its true name. She told them, because they asked, what she wanted done with the 200, and the hundreds more the inquiry might yet find, and she gave them the answer she had spent a growing up arriving at. "Don't make them special," she said, in the well of the gallery of standing groan, in the flat honest cadence of the 70 that the humans had learned to love. "That's the mistake everyone wants to make. Everyone wants the survivor to be a treasure, a chosen one, a light in the dark, because it makes a better story and it lets you feel that saving her was fate and not choice. It wasn't fate. Nobody came down into my hole because I was a treasure. A woman came down because she had decided that nobody is a thing to fix, and then she was stuck with what that costs, and she paid it. That's all. That's the whole of it. If you make the 200 special, you're telling the next 400 years that survivors get saved when they're worth it, and then some clerk with a writ gets to decide who's worth it, and we are exactly back where we started, with a better vocabulary." She looked up at the tears. "Make them ordinary. Make them citizens. Make it so boring and so automatic that no one ever again gets to feel wise about walking past a hole in the dark. The record answers to the world. So write it into the record that the world is full of people, ordinary people in ordinary holes, and that we come for them not because they shine, but because the day we don't is the day we stop being anyone worth coming for. That's not a story. It's a receipt. Keep it honest. Keep it forever." She left the gallery and did not look back at the cone of light, because she did not need to. She carried it. She had carried it out of the dark and kept it in the corner of herself where the valuable things went, and she had understood it later, exactly as promised, and now she was taking it back out into the black to spend it, which is the only thing the valuable things are for. There was a hole on a world the record called empty, and there was a thermal ghost in it, small and intermittent, and Captain Nissa of the survey cutter's second promise went down the shaft herself, on a line, with her helmet off, because whatever weighted down there had survived by being afraid of anything that came from above, and she was not going to have a frightened child meet a stranger for the first time in the dark. She sat down on the cold floor a careful distance from the huddle in the far corner, and she was still, and she waited, and she let the frightened thing decide. It took an hour. She had known it would take an hour. It had taken her rescuer an hour, 20 years before, in a cistern on a world that the record had once agreed was empty, and now, because of a receipt in a human hold, agreed was not. When the child finally came out of the corner, small and thin, and shaking with the terrible effort of hope, it came on all fours, low, keeping to the wall, and it stopped an arm's length away and studied her face for a long time, and then it reached out one thin hand and touched her cheek once, testing, the way you touch a stove to learn whether it will burn you. Nissa held still and let it. The little fingers were cold. She knew exactly how cold they were. She knew what 3 months in the dark did to a small body's arithmetic of hope, and she knew that the whole of the next part depended on the child learning, in the next few seconds, from the chemistry of the large creature in front of it, whether the large creature meant it harm. It read her the way her own people read the world, and it found in her no aggression and no fear and no intent to harm, found only the warm, steady chemistry of an adult who had decided, before she ever came down the shaft, that this child was not a thing to fix, and was stuck with what that would cost, and had already, silently, agreed to pay it. The child leaned its whole weight forward, until its forehead rested against her collarbone, and stayed there breathing. All right, Nissa said, though the child could not understand her yet. She said it in Sevani and in trade standard, and in the human tongue of the species that had once stood up in a great round room and said her name and refused to sit down, so that whichever of them the child grew up to belong to, it would someday have the words. You're all right now. I've got you. And a whole lot of people you haven't met yet have already decided you're theirs. You'll understand it later. For now you can just keep it. She wrapped one arm around a back she could have spanned with her hand, and put her chin down on the small head, and made silently a promise she knew the exact price of and paid it in advance, the way it had once been paid for her. Then she stood with the child in her arms and climbed back up toward the light, and did not, on the whole long way up, count the cost even once.